Things that sound fake but were proven to be true. Bloodthirsty parrots. When you think of a parrot, it's almost impossible to not think of it being on the shoulder of a pirate. And admittedly, they're kind of the perfect contrast. You've got the dark, dirty, smelly pirate and his bright, colorful counterpart. And while at surface value, it may seem like they have almost nothing in common, what if I told you that the habit that they both shared was their bloodlust? Let me explain. In the South Island of New Zealand, during the mid to late 1860s, sheep farmers began to notice a very strange and concerning pattern. Their animals were beginning to become attacked in the night, and these attacks all exhibited similar behavior. Sheep, for example, were being found with the lower part of their back torn open, in some cases with their vital organs being exposed and dying shortly after this attack due to the disease and trauma. For some years, farmers were confused and shocked on what could possibly be causing these attacks, as it didn't look like any normal predator. And interestingly, it wasn't. Initially, it was prominently believed that this had to be some sort of new, deadly disease that was spreading across livestock. Although, with the attacks becoming more and more violent, it became obvious that this couldn't be any sort of disease. And it was around that time when the disease theory was beginning to lose prominence that the truth was finally revealed. At least to some. In 1868, James MacDonald, a shepherd and sheep farmer, stayed up all night watching his livestock. And what he noticed shocked him. During the middle of the night, he noticed a kea land on the back of one of his sheep and begin pecking and ripping open the lower back of his livestock. In some cases, literally to death. Now, for context, a kea is a species of parrot that lives specifically in New Zealand. And surprisingly, there's actually over 400 different species of parrot. And interestingly, across almost all of these 400 species, parrots remain relatively similar. They are all extremely intelligent, and they are all, for the most part, herbivores, except for the occasional insect, which is considered rare. However, there is only a few species of parrot that have ever been known to feed off of dead animal carcasses, with one of those extremely rare species being the kea. And while the kea was somewhat known to pick at dead animal carcasses from time to time, nobody would have ever believed that this parrot was actively and aggressively hunting not only live animals, but live animals that were so much bigger than them. Which is why, at first, the kea was never even suspected. And it's also why, for almost nearly 100 years after that this was discovered to be going on, people still didn't believe that parrots were the cause of livestock being killed. And it actually ended up becoming a pretty large political issue in the South Island of New Zealand. You see, after it became obvious to farmers that their livestock was being attacked and ultimately killed because of the kea, they took it upon themselves to begin killing these birds at every opportunity to protect their animals. However, the scientific community was not happy with their actions whatsoever. And many naturalists and scientists at the time actually believed that farmers were making the entire thing up to justify killing birds for fun. And it was because of the scientific community's mindset that they actually actively dismissed all of the claims from these farmers, assuming they were lying for their own personal gain. And while that's definitely unfortunate, it's also not completely unreasonable, because it was also during this time that these birds were being hunted into near extinction. And it was due to the hunting of these farmers that caused the kea to be classified as a protected animal, meaning that the hunting of them was actually outlawed, which definitely didn't sit well with farmers who were actively having their livestock attacked by these creatures. However, ultimately their hands were tied. And also, if a kea happened to die on their property and nobody knew about it, I'm assuming those farmers wouldn't go rushing to tell the authorities. Regardless, when I say that the scientific community was not believing these farmers, I mean it. And this wasn't a multi-year thing. It took over a century for the scientific community to finally accept the fact that keas were actively preying on sheep and other large animals. Like I mentioned, the first eyewitness sighting of a kea attacking a sheep took place in 1868. And while after that time, locally, farmers knew who and what was attacking their sheep, the scientific community was not sold. And they remained unsold for a shocking amount of time. For example, in 1962, nearly 100 years after the original sighting, animal specialist R.J. Jackson decided to look into the case. And after reading all of the claims and looking at all of the photos surrounding kea attacks of sheep, he concluded that while the bird may or may not have actually attacked a sheep, the bird likely mistook the sheep for being dead, as the sheep was probably already sick, and the bird was in no way, shape, or form an actual predator. And that conclusion was more or less of the accepted reality until August of 1992, basically 130 years after the first eyewitness sighting. In August of 1992, the first ever videos were taken of keas attacking sheep in the night, and it was officially proven without the shadow of a doubt that at least some Kia will actively and knowingly attack and feed on healthy sheep, seemingly for no discretionable reason. In these videos, it was proven once and for all that the Kia will use its long, curved, and powerful beak to rip through the wool on the back of the sheep to get directly to fat deposits that were located near the lower back of the sheep. And interestingly, while the bird was not able to directly kill the sheep in most cases, infections from these large wounds caused by the birds were the most common cause of death after these attacks. After the scientific acceptance of this reality was officially formed, the most up-to-date conclusion we have about this entire phenomenon is that simply because the Kia is so intelligent, as a result of their intelligence, they become curious and opportunistic hunters. Meaning, at least some Kias realized that there is fat deposits in the back of sheep, and sheep are vulnerable to attacks on the lower of their back. And it's believed that in the Kia community, not every Kia does this because it's simply a learned behavior. And unless a Kia is taught this at a young age or discovers it on their own, they are unlikely to do such an attack. However, enough of them did learn this attack and created the situation I'm telling you about now. And it kind of sounds like I'm talking about Pokemon. It learned this attack, but yeah, no, it's crazy. I really wanted to start this video with this example specifically because not only do carnivore parrots eating sheep sound like something out of a bad horror movie, it also sounds like something that no reasonable person would believe, which is why nobody in the scientific community believed it either. That was until it was proven to be true by the scientific community, albeit 130 years after the locals had already figured it out. Which, if you ask me, sounds about right. So yeah, the next time you're hanging out with a parrot, just remember that while the chances of it digging in your butt until you die are low, they're not zero. Map manipulation. I remember being a young bro sitting in geography class, just completely mind-boggled by the naming scheme of both Greenland and Iceland. To me, it made no sense. Why is Iceland so green? And why is Greenland so icy? At the time, it just seemed like some sick joke my geography teacher was playing, and I never felt like I got a true, satisfying answer. And if you've ever had a curiosity about this conundrum, then you've come to the right video. Because today, I've once and for all gotten to the bottom of why these countries have opposite names. And the explanation literally sounds like somebody made it up. But of course, it's true. The year is 950 AD, and Eric the Red had just been born in Norway. Eric lived a relatively normal Norse upbringing that was until his father was exiled from Norway, meaning that him and his entire family had to leave the country immediately. And they decided to get in a boat and sail west towards Iceland. And if you're curious where Iceland got its name, it's kind of debated, but the two most popular beliefs were that because the Vikings had very simple naming structures, they would just kind of name places after whatever they saw and then land. And it's believed that when settlers first landed there, they saw snow and ice and therefore named it Iceland. Although some others believe that it's called Iceland because one of the original settlers, depressed after losing a daughter and all of his livestock, climbed a mountain, looked down the mountain at the fjord, and saw massive icebergs flowing through a river, and for that reason decided to name the island he was settling Iceland. But we're not talking about Iceland, we're talking about Greenland because it's bigger and better. But back to Eric and his exiled family. After arriving in Iceland, they were quickly able to adapt to this new way of life. Eric grew from a young boy to a man and got married and began living an adult life in this place he now called home. However, as an adult, he quickly began to follow in his father's footsteps. Because in 982, at the age of 32, Eric the Red himself was exiled from Iceland as he was convicted of manslaughter. And he decided to take this opportunity of exile to not go back to Norway, but to discover a place he's heard of but never visited. An island we know of now as Greenland. At the time, people had visited Greenland, but nobody had been able to successfully establish a settlement. And it was for that reason that Eric the Red made it his mission to successfully colonize this new island. During his expedition, when Eric arrived to Greenland, he reached a point near the southern tip of the island that, interestingly, at least at the time, had very similar conditions to Iceland. And to him, he took this as a promising sign because he saw how well Iceland was flourishing at this time, and he therefore believed that he could do the same thing on this island as well, creating his own successful settlement. And while he was unaware of the extent of the island or the true nature of the island, at least initially, he was pretty convinced that he had his own, basically Iceland 2.0, although it was missing one thing: good marketing. And it was that marketing that Eric eventually came up with that not only made him infamous, but made the name scheme of the country completely iconic. After 3 long, grueling years of developing his own small settlement in Greenland, his exile was finally up. And his first order of business was to return back to Iceland and sing the praises of the settlement he had just established. And he did exactly that. In the summer of 985, Eric returned to Iceland and began telling everybody he could about the amazing time he was having on the island of Greenland. And the stories he was telling and the name he gave the island were both extremely strategic. In his own words, Eric literally said people would be attracted to go to a place if it had a favorable name, and he believed that Iceland was too harsh of a name, but Greenland sounded like a place of opportunity and beauty, and that was the story he sold to settlers. And after that first summer he spent back in Iceland, he was able to convince a large group of settlers to follow him back from Iceland to Greenland. However, out of the 25 ships that followed him back, only 14 arrived. However, on those 14 ships were enough people to start developing successful colonies. And the rest, literally, is history. So yeah, if you're curious why Iceland is called Iceland and why Greenland is called Greenland, it's not because the world is playing a sick joke on you. It's because Iceland was likely discovered in the wintertime, and Vikings just have very simple naming schemes. And Greenland, while it was settled at a time and in a place where it was relatively lush, the name of Greenland was purely marketing, and it just kind of stuck. And is just another jarring example of things that seem normal to us but only exist because of marketing. And we've talked about quite a few of them on this channel. Another notable example being diamond engagement rings. The only reason we do that is because a diamond company told us we should. Oh, and as an extra bonus fun fact, Eric's son was actually Leif Erikson, the first ever Norseman to explore the land of Vineland, which is what the Vikings called the eastern part of North America that they originally settled in. And it kind of goes to show two things. One, that explorer blood runs deep, and two, Vikings do really have a simple naming structure. It's believed they called North America Vineland because they saw a lot of vines when they landed. You really can't make this stuff up. The Cadaver Court Case. Pope Formosus was born in 1816 AD in Rome. Not much is known or documented about his early life. However, it is in the second half of his life and even after his life ended that his story becomes rather interesting and almost unbelievable. In 864 AD, Formosus becomes appointed as the Cardinal Bishop of Portus. And in 891 AD, at the ripe age of 75, Formosus finally earns the title of Pope. And while at face value it may seem like his entire political and religious career has come to this moment, things were almost only downhill from this point. Because during Formosus' time as Pope, things were politically unstable to say the least in Rome and Italy as a whole. Most notably, getting into some serious disagreements with the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Like I mentioned, at the time, there was a ton of political instability in Rome, and there was literally no one centralized power, only large factions essentially. And during Formosus' time as Pope, he had to make a very important decision almost instantly after becoming the Pope. While the Pope wasn't a direct political entity, he was still a vitally important figure in the daily lives of almost everybody at the time. While the Emperor would have legal significance, the Pope had spiritual and religious importance. And it was for that reason that having the Pope on your side as a political leader was very crucial. Hence why his blessing was so important. Now, after Formosus became the Pope, he had to choose a candidate between one of the two most popular factions at the time. A candidate from the Spoleto faction or a Carolingian pick. And there is a ton of history and lore between these two factions. It really does go beyond the scope of the video. So for the sake of time and simplicity, just understand these two groups as opposing groups fighting for power in Rome. Initially, in 892, Formosus actually crowned the Spoleto pick as the co-ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, meaning he gave his blessing and endorsement to the Spoleto faction. However, only 3 years later in 895, Formosus decided that he kind of changed his mind and literally decided to invite the Carolingian pick, the Arnulf of Carinthia, to come and invade Italy so that he could actually come receive the crown from Formosus himself. Unsurprisingly, the Spoletans saw this as a major backstab to their cause and faction, although there wasn't much they could do at the time. However, only a year later in 896, both Pope Formosus and the new emperor that he had just crowned, Arnulf from Carinthia, both died of natural causes. And with the death of Formosus came a power vacuum. A power vacuum that allowed the Spoletans to finally regain control. However, it wasn't just power they were after. They also wanted revenge. Now, technically, after Pope Formosus died, there was another pope named Pope Boniface, but he was only a pope for 15 days and then died of gout, at least allegedly. And after Pope Boniface was Pope Stephen VI. And this pope was very sympathetic to the Spoleto faction and was likely installed by the Spoleto faction. Regardless, now with the Speletan Pope in power and more Speletan power than we've seen up until this point, there was truly only one way for the Speletans to get their revenge on Pope Formosus for what they believed to be the betrayal that he enacted on them. And how they decided about going about this revenge was by digging up the corpse of Pope Formosus, which at this point had been buried for over 9 months. The body of Pope Formosus was removed from its tomb, dressed up in traditional garb, and literally sat up on a throne in a traditional Roman court. And this decomposing corpse of a dead pope was officially on trial for perjury, violation of canon law, and illegally becoming pope. Now, while Pope Formosus was definitely not a perfect individual, and his entire religious and political career is pretty shoddy in some locations, there are many that remember him for the good that he did as pope, most notably advocating for a lack of nepotism within the church, as well as other notable reforms that are outside of the scope of the video. Regardless, there wasn't absolutely no basis for the crimes that this corpse was on trial for. However, most logically thinking people, even if they did believe that a dead person did something bad while they were living, wouldn't find it to be reasonable to then dig up the body of that individual after they died, to then put them on trial, to not only prove your point, but also to dismantle the legacy of that individual. And that right there was essentially the entire point of this trial. Obviously, the new pope and powers that be in Rome at the time, the Skeletons, were not trying to get Pope Formosus' side of the story. They simply wanted to go to extreme lengths to not only discredit his life's work, but to permanently embarrass him as a man to ensure that he was never remembered as a good individual, and was either not remembered at all or remembered for being a criminal. And on top of simply embarrassing Formosus himself, this display was also meant to not only embarrass but discourage the supporters of Formosus, with some taking this as a very real threat of violence if they happened to disobey the new pope or new powers at be. This trial took place in a cathedral in Rome in January of 897. And the entire situation is known as the Cadaver Synod, and it is regarded as one of the most insane recorded moments in human history, or at the very least in the history of court and law. Regardless, the result of the trial was, unsurprisingly, Formosus being found guilty of all charges. And as a result of that, he was in the courtroom, stripped of all of his traditional garb. He was also stripped of his 3 blessing fingers, and then his naked, dead, decomposing body was dragged through town for all to see and threw his body into the Tiber River, essentially saying this man, who was once the Pope, was not even worthy of a proper burial. The ultimate goal of this entire situation was to permanently erase the legacy of Pope Formosus and forever discredit whatever shreds of his legacy still remained. But interestingly, it almost had the opposite effect, because while the powers that be may have been satisfied with this display, it was the locals who were extremely disgusted by this act. Both civilians and other political figures, those of which may or may not have agreed with Pope Formosus, but still saw this display as completely disgusting treatment of a previous pope. Public perception of the new pope quickly changed, riots broke out, and almost instantly after feeling like he just got his vengeance, Pope Stephen was stripped of power and thrown in jail, where he soon after died. The 2 popes following Pope Stephen ended up reinstating the legacy and importance of Pope Formosus and completely condemned the action of Pope Stephen. And they did actually give Pope Formosus a proper burial. And it's interesting because while the popes that came after Pope Stephen disagreed with him, they actually, believe it or not, didn't dig up his dead body to put it on court to publicly humiliate it and further try to prove their point. The entire story of the Cadaver Synod sounds like a bad fever dream. If you told me that during the 800s there was a pope that felt so betrayed by the previous pope that he decided to dig up his 9-month-old corpse only to dress it up, put it on court, find it guilty, take its clothes off, drag it through the street, and throw it in the river simply to prove a political point about revenge, I probably wouldn't believe it. Now, I would have believed it in almost any other context, but you would imagine that when it comes to the church, or at least the immense amount of respect that people have of the Pope, you would imagine people wouldn't dare do such a thing to the corpse of the Pope, if for no other reason than the fear of the potential spiritual repercussions. But even with the Cadaver Synod being one of the most unbelievable and crazy historic events that took place not too long ago, it's also a very gruesome and interesting display of what exactly can happen when power, politics, and religion corrupt the minds of individuals and allow them to justify some completely depraved actions. Now, if you are loving this video about things and stories that sound fake but are actually true and want to see a part 2, please leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 2 so that I know you guys want it. This video has been so fun to make, and there are literally so many things I could talk about that I really want to. And I guess if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. According to YouTube, only 35% of you guys are subscribed, which is insane. But with that, let's get to the final entry of this video. The Sleepy Shipwreck. If I were to ask you how you would go about surviving a shipwreck, what would you say? Would you suggest wearing a life jacket at all times? Staying only within the vicinity of an emergency boat while on the ship? Maybe staying sober for the entirety of your boat ride to ensure that you are always alert? What if I told you that, at least for some people, the secret to surviving maritime disaster was actually sleep? Linda Morgan was born in 1942 in Mexico City, Mexico. And while she had a relatively normal childhood, she would quickly become infamous and actually known as the Miracle Girl at only 14 years of age, for something she had almost no control in. It was a foggy night on July 26, 1956. Linda and her family were on the SS Andrea Doria, a luxury transatlantic ocean liner that had just been put into waters only 3 years prior. Linda was on this boat with her mother, her stepsister, and her stepfather, as well as almost 1,700 other individuals. Everything about this voyage so far seemed pleasant, but it wasn't until day turned into night and the fog began to thicken that tragedy struck. Linda and her stepsister shared a cabin. Linda's bed was on the side of the cabin closest to the outside of the ship, and Linda's stepsister's bed was on the opposite side of the room, closest to the door to the hallway. And the girl's parents had the cabin next door. When the family went to bed on this night, they knew that the fog was a potential issue, but they also noted that because they didn't actively see the captain on the deck engaging with passengers, they knew that he was actively working on navigating the ship, meaning that the situation was obviously under control, allowing them to get a good night's sleep. However, that wasn't exactly the case. Nearly 45 minutes after the family had gone to bed, the unimaginable happened. Another ocean liner known as the MS Stockholm struck the side of the SS Andrea Doria, and that Swedish ship nearly penetrated 40 meters into the SS Andrea Doria. And the biggest area of impact on the SS Andrea Doria were the exact two cabins where Linda and her family were staying, which unfortunately had some extremely dire consequences. Linda's 8-year-old stepsister that she shared the cabin with unfortunately did not survive her injuries. And in the cabin next door, Linda's stepfather passed away from head trauma, and her mother was gravely injured. However, surprisingly, what happened to Linda was seemingly impossible. During the collision, gnarled and twisted pieces of metal created by the impact of these two ships somehow seemingly scooped Linda and the bed she was in out of the SS Andrea Doria and placed her safely onto the deck of the MS Stockholm, essentially somehow not only allowing her to survive the impact that killed so many, but also placing her directly in a safer location, albeit not so gently. She suffered a broken arm and bloodied legs, as well as serious confusion and serious emotional trauma. When Linda awoke from her unconsciousness, I could only imagine the thoughts going through her head. She went to bed in a first-class cabin and woke up under the stars on a gnarled ship, somehow in the same bed. And it was for this reason when she woke up, she was screaming for her parents in Spanish. And surprisingly, a crew member on the MS Stockholm not only heard her screams, but spoke Spanish and was able to communicate with her, which is how he learned that this girl was not from the MS Stockholm. She was on the SS Andrea Doria and somehow was placed on the ship seemingly inexplicably. While the SS Andrea Doria did eventually end up completely sinking later that night due to the damage it sustained during the impact, only, and I use that word lightly, 46 people lost their life during this horrific accident, with a majority of those casualties taking place at the direct zone of impact, making Linda Morgan's story that much more unbelievable. Interestingly, Linda's biological father was a news reporter working in New York, and on the night of this tragic accident, he had to report the news of what had just happened, knowing that his daughter was on one of those ships and possibly dead. And while I'm sure that night for him must have seemed like an eternity, the following day he was informed that his daughter was alive and well. And shortly after he received this information, she, as well as everybody else on the MS Stockholm, did arrive in New York as safe and sound as they could be. And that fact alone is surprising enough that this ship, the MS Stockholm, with this much damage was able to make it all the way to New York from the crash site. But at this point, I'll take any good news I can get. And I would personally much rather an anomaly than a tragedy. Mythical creatures that turned out to be real. There's an old saying that goes, truth is stranger than fiction. And I would argue in the case of mythical creatures, this rule definitely applies. The concept of mythology and mythical creatures has existed for thousands upon thousands of years. And with such a long and rich history, it was only a matter of time until some of these mythical creatures turned out to not be myths at all. Which is why in today's double feature, I'm going to start the video by discussing mythical creatures that turned out to just be creatures, and then I'm going to discuss creatures that still remain mythical, but are heavily believed to be real. Let's begin. Mountain spirits. Deep within the Indonesian jungle lives a group of people known as the Moni people. The Moni are an indigenous tribe of people from the Central Papua and Western New Guinea regions of Indonesia. They primarily speak their own Moni language, and in total there is roughly 28,000 Moni people. Not much is publicly known or understood about the Moni people or their traditions. However, one piece of their culture that has now become sort of mainstream is the not-so-mythical creature known as the mountain spirits. For countless generations, the Moni people have passed down stories of a mysterious black and white creature that lived in the forest. And this creature was believed to be a spirit, a positive spirit that should be protected. The Moni people themselves even said that this mythical creature walked upright like a small man. And while that may seem interesting, for the longest time there was no evidence to back up the claim of this black and white small man spirit that inhabited this remote part of Indonesia. Which is why, for the longest time, the mountain spirit was considered to be something of myth to foreigners. That was until 1994, when the story of the spiritual mythical creature living deep within the Indonesian jungle came across the desk of a man named Tim Flannery. Tim Flannery was a highly decorated researcher from Australia. And when he heard the stories of the mythical creature, he knew there had to be something more to it than just fairy tales. Which is why he booked a flight and was determined to separate fact from fiction himself. After landing in Indonesia and traveling deep into the jungle to meet the Moni people, he was briefed on their customs and culture, and then was briefed on the mountain spirit. The Moni people informed Tim that the mountain spirit was elusive, being seen only rarely by the locals, and that if it was seen, it was to be respected, as it was believed that this mythical creature was a spiritual entity. Timothy could tell that the Moni people took this seriously, because when he asked them if they'd ever tried to hunt this creature, they instantly denied ever trying to hunt, attack, or approach the spirit, as it was something they almost instantly knew they were to protect. However, even with that interesting story and vague description of white and black creature that sometimes walks on two legs, Tim really didn't know what he was getting himself into. That was until he spent multiple days in the Indonesian jungle and didn't come face to face with any sort of mythical creature or spirit, but actually came in direct contact with a creature known as the dingoso. That's right, the mountain spirit is not a spirit at all. It's actually a rather endangered and extremely rare animal that, in my opinion, is actually more interesting than the mountain spirit ever could be. Let me explain. The dingo is a long-tailed marsupial that can only be found in mountain forests on the west side of New Guinea in Indonesia, which means that for the longest time, the Moni people were the only people in the entire world to even be aware of this animal, even if they did consider it to be a spirit, which honestly isn't unfair, because while they considered it spirit, the rest of the world considered it to be folktale and not even real at all. However, the Moni people knew what they saw, and in my opinion, you should always trust the locals. Back to the dingoso though. The dingoso is also a mammal that is roughly shaped like a bear. It lives in trees. It's the size of a Labrador dog, and believe it or not, it is technically a breed of kangaroo, which, if you ask me, is the most interesting and random combination of attributes you could probably imagine. Regardless, after Tim Flannery was able to confirm the existence of this mysterious creature in 1994, the entire suspicion of the mountain spirits just being fairy tale was broken, and actually proven to be fact. And while this discovery was shocking news to the rest of the world, to the Moni people, this was simply affirming something they already knew. And fortunately, it didn't break their belief whatsoever. Even after Tim was able to confirm the existence of the dingoso, and then later name it and categorize it, they still treated it as a sacred symbol, and believed that the dingoso was the physical embodiment of the spirits of their ancestors. Which, in my opinion, is pretty wholesome. Interestingly, at least in my opinion, if the Moni people didn't consider the dingoso to be so sacred, it would have likely been hunted, probably into extinction, because of how rare and endangered this animal already is. And if that were to have happened, then realistically, the dingoso would have likely never been discovered by the scientific community, and therefore remaining a mythical creature forever. Although we know that wasn't the case, and in 1994, the dingoso was proven to be a real animal and not just a mythical creature. Although it wasn't until 2009 when it was actually filmed for the first time ever, after a BBC documentary crew and a local Moni tribesman spent 11 days in the jungle searching just to find one dingoso or mountain spirit. The devil bird. In rural Sri Lanka, there has been a long-told legend of a mythical creature known as the ulama, or the devil bird. The lore behind the devil bird was simple yet terrifying, and it was for those reasons that it quickly became legend. It is said that if you are in a rural part of Sri Lanka at night, potentially near a jungle or forest, then you could be at risk of hearing the blood-curdling, human-like shriek of the devil bird. Now, while you never saw the devil bird, the shriek alone was enough to turn your blood cold and terrify you, leaving most frozen in fear. However, this shriek wasn't only something that would temporarily scare you, as it had a deeper meaning. According to Sri Lankan folklore, the shriek of the devil bird wasn't only terrifying, it was an omen of imminent death. and it was believed that if you were outside at night and had been exposed to or have heard the shriek of the devil bird, you or someone you knew or loved was soon going to die. Just the lore alone around this mythical creature is enough to have you invested, even without any description of what it may or may not look like. And it's for this reason that this story was told and believed so heavily within Sri Lanka for generations and generations. Although, for people that were not local to Sri Lanka, when they were told about the devil bird custom, many people disregarded it as something of just that, legend, something of myth, something that was, well, downright not real or non-existent. That was until non-locals started to hear the shriek for themselves. And because the shriek was so terrifying and so human-like and so unlike anything that they've heard elsewhere before, biologists knew they had to take a closer look at what could possibly be causing this myth. Because it was too long running to simply be one hoaxer, and it was too unique and terrifying to be something that was already currently known. And it was with that in 2001, after some time searching, experts were able to confirm with a high likelihood that the devil bird or ulama was maybe not as mythical as people once thought, and that it was more likely the spot-bellied eagle owl, a bird that in its own right is definitely terrifying. The spot-bellied eagle owl is a huge bird of prey that literally just looks terrifying, like it looks like a mythical creature. These birds live primarily in the forest and live mainly in India and Southeast Asia. They reportedly weigh around 3 pounds, and most notably, this owl is now famous after its semi-recently discovered human-sounding call. The call that essentially made this eagle owl a mythical creature in the first place. Now, with that being said, I know I can't keep talking about this legendary sound without showing it to you. So I'm gonna play a bit of audio of a recording somebody took of an actual spot-bellied eagle owl. But I did want to give fair warning in case you were superstitious yourself and did believe that this call may actually bring death to you or a loved one. Which, I wouldn't blame you if that were the case, but with that, here's the sound. Sea serpents. I see serpents. Do you see serpents? I'll tell you who saw serpents: sailors. Sailors saw serpents so often that they became legendary mythical creatures. Sea serpents were first reported as massive snake-like creatures that were found in deep, dangerous waters. And in folklore stories of these mythological creatures, they were described as dangerous, ship-attacking monsters. Stories of sea serpents exist in many different cultures and mythologies. For example, Norse mythology, Babylonian mythology, and even Greek mythology. But what if I told you that, once again, this mythical creature was perhaps not so mythical? For thousands of years, different cultures and civilizations described seeing a nearly impossibly long, snake-like creature approaching their boats and even attacking them. It was actually the persistence of these extremely similar stories being told across numerous cultures that actually inspired scientists in the 1700s to try to finally put this myth to bed once and for all. However, in their studies, they didn't find a nothing burger. What they actually found was fish tacos. That was corny, but we're keeping it in. No, but in reality, in 1772, scientists found what they believed to be what everybody was considering sea serpents to be in all of these different mythological accounts. This fish was identified as the oarfish. And the oarfish, similar to some of the other entries on this list, once again just goes to show that fact is sometimes stranger than fiction. The oarfish is an extremely long, ribbon-like fish that is typically only found deep in tropical oceans and is usually rarely ever seen by humans. One subsect of the oarfish, known as the giant oarfish, is the longest bony fish alive and can grow up to 36 feet long. Besides just being rare and massive, oarfish are also extremely unique because they have been sighted swimming vertically, meaning they're not, doing normal fish stuff. They're literally swimming as if they were walking to work. Besides their weird methods of transportation, they also have a rather unique look to them. They have a silvery, scaly body, but they also have a bright red dorsal fin along its back, which definitely makes it stand out against blue water and also gives it a rather mythical appearance to some individuals, further bolstering the theory that this never-before-seen fish was a mythical creature and not your average fish. Which, if you think about it, isn't unreasonable for somebody in the 15 or 1600s or even, earlier than that to see a crazy never-before-seen fish and to assume it's, well, something of myth rather than a never-before-seen fish because of how different it was from most fish we know today. or were even known at the time for that matter. Regardless, even though today it is commonly believed that most sea serpent accounts are simply encounters with oarfish, in the modern day, now that this mythical creature has been more or less demystified, it doesn't mean that there isn't any superstition still surrounding this fish. And what I mean by that is that even today, in 2026, the oarfish is still considered not a sea serpent, but a sign of a doomsday event coming. And I'm not joking. It is commonly believed by some that if you find an oarfish washed up on the beach somewhere, there is a very high chance that there will be a devastating earthquake or tsunami to happen shortly after the discovery of this fish. Now, while calling the oarfish a doomsday fish may seem like just another legendary attribute being associated with an animal that is real and not mythical, that superstition has unfortunately been bolstered in recent years. From 2009 to 2010 in Japan, there was over 20 oarfish sightings that were washed up on the beaches. And in 2011 in Japan, there was a tragic earthquake that ended up killing over 20,000 people, which has led some people to believe that potentially the sightings of the oarfish had something to do with it, or at least predicted the tragedy. Now, regardless of what you believe personally, I think the story of the oarfish is just so interesting. Because it started as a fish that was thought to be a sea serpent of legendary proportions, and then it was found out to just be an extremely odd and rare fish. But even then, within its scientific discovery, it took on a whole new meaning as a doomsday fish, which later went on to kind of prove that it may or may not have some mythical properties after all.
The black swan.
It is reported that in the 1400s, 1500s, and even 1600s in Europe, there was a saying that if you called something a black swan, you were essentially saying that something did not exist. Consider it a post-medieval way of saying when pigs fly. The analogy of a black swan was reportedly rather common, and it, for a long time, was rooted in fact. Across all of Europe, every swan that had ever been seen ever was white, and it was believed for that reason that swans across the globe were only white, because only white swans existed in Europe. Hence the existence and popularity of the black swan analogy. Regardless, up until 1697, according to Europe, swans were white and only white, and a swan of any other color was simply not possible. That was until 1697, when Dutch explorer William de Vlaming arrived in Western Australia on an expedition and just so happened to almost instantly be met with a creature that he and everybody he had ever known considered to be something that truly did not exist. He came face to face with a group of black swans. Obviously shocked, William knew that he had to take some examples home with him to prove he was not crazy, because if he did go home and claim to have seen black swans, he would not only be ridiculed, but potentially even be exiled for suggesting such a crazy thing. And it was with him showing the rest of Europe the existence of the black swan that the entire European mindset was essentially shifted. Initially only about the existence of other types of swans, but the lesson that was taught from this experience was pretty significant. The moral of the story that was kind of taken away from this entire experience down the line was that just because you haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And it's actually for that reason exactly that I wanted to add it in this video, because as almost every creature I've discussed has proven, just because you haven't seen it yet doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the story of the black swan is almost a perfect example, because it wasn't even thought to have existed by anybody. It was literally thought to have never existed, and its mythology was actually in the fact that it could not exist simply because it had never been seen, and it was the opposite of what was seen. To Europe at the time, a black swan was the least likely thing possible, and I'm sure you see the irony. Regardless, the revelation of the existence of the black swan was so significant in fact that it actually coined a new term. Before this event, black swans were an analogy of something that simply could not happen, would not happen, does not exist. But after the discovery of black swans in Europe, the term black swan or black swan event was used to describe an event that was rare, unexpected, and challenged beliefs, or has or had outsized effects on society, which is pretty interesting to think about.
The duck-billed bozo.
Okay, I'm gonna keep this section short because it's technically not a mythical creature, but I really wanted to talk about it because this story is so funny. As most people probably know by now, platypuses are real, but also insane. And likely the best example of fact is stranger than fiction. And that's because platypuses literally have mythical creature level lore while being an extremely real creature. And platypuses have such mythical creature level lore that when the first platypus bodies were discovered by European naturalists, the Europeans actually believed that these bodies had to be mutilated bodies of an assortment of different animals because of how strange the platypus appeared. Let me set the scene. The year is 1799. A British explorer is in Australia, once again, and finds this weird creature. They don't know what it's called, they don't know what it's all about, but he sends it back to Britain. The naturalists in Britain examined this creature that was sent from Australia, and the conclusion they come to was not that this was some unseen animal, but they actually came to the conclusion that somebody must have tampered with this specimen simply because of how outrageous it was. At the time, the platypus was officially considered a hoax by the scientific community simply because of how weird it was. In case you're unfamiliar with exactly how strange platypuses are, let me fill you in. For starters, platypuses are essentially beavers with duck bills and otter feet, and it was actually that exact combination of animals that these British naturalists thought were put together by somebody on the ship who tampered with the specimen. On top of that, platypuses are mammals, but mammals that lay eggs, which is essentially a contradiction, but we're only getting started. On top of laying eggs, platypuses are also venomous. That's right, they basically have a little toenail or little horn on their fins that they will use to stab their prey with and inject them with venom. And if that wasn't crazy enough, while platypuses are amphibious, when they go underwater, they close their eyes and ears, making them deaf and blind, and it's because of this in water they rely on electromagnetic pulses to hunt, which they do rather effectively. And on top of that, they also outsource teeth. That's right, platypuses don't have teeth, but if they need to chew, they'll put rocks in their mouth so that they can use something to crush their food. Now, you might be asking, if they lay eggs, do they feed their young like birds? And the answer is, of course not. Since platypuses are mammals, they have milk, but they don't have nipples. They feed their young through their armpit milk. That's right, their milk comes out of their armpits. I could go on a lot longer about platypus facts, but I think you guys get the idea. Platypuses are so strange that when they were first discovered, they were considered to be a hoax or something of mythology. And even after describing this very real creature to you now, I'm still not convinced that platypuses aren't some mythical creature that snuck their way into reality. Like, I've made a lot of videos on mythical creatures back in the day. They actually were kind of the cornerstone of my channel. And if you watch those videos, well, you're definitely an OG. But I mention this because I have learned about and talked about plenty of mythical creatures that don't have nearly the cool lore that platypuses do, which, if nothing else, proves that truth is definitely stranger than fiction. But let's move on. Okay, I want to use this moment to mark the turning point in this video. As I mentioned earlier, this video is going to be a two-parter, basically a double feature. I wanted to start with creatures that were verifiably real, or at least extremely closely linked to real creatures, and scientifically believed to be those creatures. But now I'm going to discuss creatures that are either more loosely connected to real creatures that I didn't want to necessarily say as real because the connection's a bit loose, or creatures that essentially have no basis but are still heavily believed in some cultures. Of course, there was a bunch of other real mythical creatures I wanted to mention at the beginning of this video, but I can only add so many. So if you want to see a part 2 where I talk about more mythical creatures that are provably real, then please leave a like or leave a comment on this video saying part 2. And finally, I wanted to mention a few honorable mentions for the first part of this video. 2 other mythical creatures that turned out to be real are the gorilla and the Heists eagle. And the only reason I didn't mention them in this video was because I actually talked about them in my video last month about myths that turned out to be fact. So if you like this video about mythical creatures that turned out to be true and want to learn about myths that turned out to be fact, after this video, check out that video. I'm going to link it in the description, and I'm also going to pop it on screen at the end of the video. So don't worry about watching it now, but I figured I'd at least mention it because I'm sure some people are going to bring it up. But with that out of the way, let's discuss more mythical creatures with a bit of a looser basis in reality.
The Chupacabra.
Honestly, I was a bit torn on where to put the Chupacabra, because personally, I think that the explanation for it makes a lot of sense, and for that reason could kind of give a real explanation for this mythical creature. But because some descriptions of this creature are so different than the logical explanation, I figured it would be a safe bet to put it in this part of the video. Now, if you're not familiar, the Chupacabra is a legendary mythical creature from Latin America specifically, and it's most popular in places like Mexico or Puerto Rico. The name Chupacabra itself, it literally means goat sucker, and this mythical creature is referred to as the goat sucker because it almost has been exclusively reported to attack livestock, specifically goats in particular. Now, visual depictions of the Chupacabra kind of vary drastically. Some descriptions state that the Chupacabra looks like a short, reptilian, alien-looking creature that's a couple feet tall, covered in scales and green, while others say that it kind of looks like a hairless dog with sharp teeth, glowing eyes, and no fur. But regardless of what the mixed visual accounts of the Chupacabra look like, the one common denominator among all accounts is its trademark method of murder, which is, of course, to bite the neck of the goat, drain all its blood, and leave it for dead, essentially being vampiric in nature. And it's because of this consistent and strange method of attack coupled with its strange look that turned the chupacabra into legendary folklore in Latin America, and now more parts of the world as well. Here's the deal. Some people that live in rural Latin America, whether they own livestock or not, believe in the chupacabra deeply, and for that reason go to extra measures to ensure the safety of their animals, pets, or even themselves. And it's because of this, once again, like we've seen in other sections, that the widespread belief and fear caused scientists to take a closer look at what actually was going on, because they didn't believe there was a mythical creature on the loose, and for that reason, they wanted to get to the bottom of it. And the conclusion they came to after years of research was simple, but in my opinion, likely the case. Many scientists believe that the chupacabra mythical creature is more of a sad situation than a legendary sighting. What they believe is that the chupacabra, in most cases, is a wild dog or even coyote with a disease known as mange. And what mange does, at least in severe cases, is causes the animal's hair to fall out, causes them to be emaciated, and causes them to be extra aggressive. Traits that are almost exclusively associated with chupacabra attacks and sightings. For scientists who believe that to be the case, they deem the story of the chupacabra legend to kind of highlight how folklore can sort of spawn from real-world events, but through storytelling, exaggeration, and fear of the unknown, grown into something much different, and even in some cases, an entirely new entity of its own, causing a creature in reality to be the artistic inspiration for a creature in mythology.
Vampires.
Since we were on the topic of blood-sucking mythical creatures, I figured why not talk about the most iconic of all, the vampire. The stories of vampires exist across multiple different cultures, across multiple different eras of history. But most people typically associate vampires with Eastern Europe specifically. Think Transylvania. If I asked you to describe a generic vampire, what would you describe? Tall, skinny man, slicked back black hair, emaciated skinny face, sharp teeth, sunken in eyes, basically looking dead? Interestingly, descriptions of vampires have stayed relatively consistent from the 1800s to today. Although how this mythical folklore creature is treated definitely differs by time period. At the time of the vampire's establishment in the 18th century in Eastern Europe, the story of vampires was treated a lot more like fact than fiction. For good reason too. In countries like Romania and Albania, life was hard, and mysterious disease was prevalent. It was for this reason that individuals were looking for almost any explanation they could find on why people were seemingly dying mysterious deaths. And besides just theorizing on what it could potentially be, they decided to go directly to the source, which included digging up people who have died from these diseases. And what they found was gruesome. Upon digging up the graves of people that have died, they found bodies that they believed to look alive. But not only did they look alive, they looked like they had attacked somebody. Bodies that were dug up from these graves had blood around their mouths. Their body was bloated. It appeared that their hair and fingernails had grown, and it was then assumed that these individuals were not dead at all. They were simply playing dead during the day, but at night, they were becoming undead and causing some of these mysterious deaths. And it was this discovery that triggered a short-lived mass hysteria, which we later adopted into pop culture in the modern day, but I'll get to that later. The result of this mass hysteria depends on the region in which we're talking about, but some of the most common practices involved digging up bodies and chopping off their heads if they looked like they were vampires, burning coffins or burning people as soon as they died to prevent them from becoming vampires, or simply staking down bodies in coffins to prevent them from being able to get up. Now, it should be noted that this hysteria was typically shared among lower classes, and the royalty at the time in the regions were actively trying to disprove the vampire myth so that they could prevent the amount of bodies that were being dug up. And they eventually enacted laws to prevent tampering with graves to prevent more graves from being dug up, as they believed that the whole vampire hysteria was total garbage. Now, at a glance, it might seem interesting how these royals knew anything more than the common people. But then when you realize that, well, the royals were the really only people that had access to any sort of education, including education about biology, it becomes easier to understand how potentially these people could have more context on life and reality than people that are essentially kept in the dark and have to fight every single day to get a morsel of food. Regardless, after the hysteria died down, beliefs about vampires were extinguished for the most part. However, the legend did not die, and stories that were originally used as words of warning were now used for entertainment, and eventually evolved to the vampire stories that we now know and associate with the creature today.
Mermaids.
For hundreds of years, sailors across the globe from different cultures, from different civilizations, have all told similar stories of beautiful half-woman, half-fish creatures out at sea, either seducing, singing songs, or trying to lure these sailors, typically, to their doom. But what if I told you that the mythical creature of the mermaid may have more basis in reality than you may think? And in my opinion, the explanation that experts have come up with is utterly hilarious. I really don't think I need to explain what a mermaid is, so I'm just gonna kind of get into it. But right now, if you had to guess, what real-world animal do you think inspired the story of the mermaid? If I told you the manatee, would you believe me? Because that is, of course, the case. Now, while at a glance it may seem hilarious to suggest that a manatee could inspire the story of the mermaid, these experts do have some claims that have at least a bit of validity. For starters, manatees are large, typically human-sized, at least from a distance. They live mostly in warm coastal waters, and they are considered by some to have human-like characteristics. For starters, manatees are typically seen standing in shallow water, poking their heads out of the water, which at a distance, either in foggy water or rough water, could look like a person. They also have flippers that contain bones, which they can use in a similar fashion to human hands to try to grab or move objects. And if you weren't really looking, you could say they have a sort of humanoid shape, especially if you're only seeing the bottom of them above water and the top of them underwater. Now, interestingly, if you want a historical account, in 1493, Christopher Columbus himself reported seeing mermaids, but also noted that they were not nearly as beautiful as he expected, which does give more validity to the experts' theory that, well, mermaids were actually likely inspired by manatee sightings. But in my opinion, these sailors would have had to have a lot to drink if they saw manatees and started seeing beautiful women. Like, talk about beer goggles. The craziest internet trends people actually did. We've all been there. It's late at night, you're on your phone, and you're scrolling and scrolling until you see a video on your feed that just boggles your mind. It's a video of a person doing the dumbest thing you can imagine. Then you quickly scroll away feeling truly embarrassed for that individual. But as you continue to scroll, you realize that that individual wasn't the only person doing that dumb thing. And as you continue to scroll and scroll, you notice that more and more people are seemingly all doing this incredibly stupid task. You have just stumbled upon a dumb internet trend. Whether it was on TikTok or YouTube or Facebook, the moral of the story is the same. Someone does something really dumb, it gets a lot of likes and views because people are laughing at you, not with you, and people who are hungry for views and attention begin to do the exact same thing in hopes that they could also reach internet fame. I'm not gonna act like I'm a saint here. I remember being a kid and doing the Harlem Shake, hoping to go viral and be a part of cool Harlem Shake compilations. But today's video is not about the Harlem Shake. It is about internet trends that were very obviously dangerous and in some cases even deadly. Oh, and as always, this video is only going to get crazier as the list goes on. Let's begin. The Outlet Challenge. Admittedly, this is going to be the most tame thing I talk about in this entire video, which is crazy because this first entry is literally wild. I don't know about you, but I was definitely a curious kid. And one of the things I was quite curious about is what would happen if I stuck something in the electrical outlet. Fortunately, I never acted on this curiosity. However, I know a lot of people watching this video likely did. With that being said, I do think there is a bit of a difference between doing it accidentally or not knowing what's going to happen and doing it intentionally knowing exactly what's going to happen. Which brings me to the Outlet Challenge. Starting in the early 2020s, videos started circulating on TikTok specifically of people performing a prank where they would plug their phone charger into a wall, tight enough so it would hold, but loose enough so there was a gap, and then they would drop a penny into that gap to see what would happen. The outcome of the seemingly simple machine was, well, a homemade bomb. And that's not exaggeration. Nearly every video of people performing this challenge or trend resulted in a massive flash, typically resulting in an explosion and in some cases a fire. I wasn't able to track down the exact first instance of this challenge or trend taking place, but simply by searching Outlet Challenge, you can see that this trend was making waves specifically among schools in America. If you had nothing better to do, you could literally spend days watching TikToks of people at school plugging in phone chargers, dropping pennies, and causing explosions in the back of class, which unsurprisingly is dumb, but also dangerous. In the most tame examples of people performing this trend, the outcome would only be sparks and electrical shortage. However, in more extreme examples, full-blown electrical fires were started, smoke coming out of outlets, electrical outlets melting, and walls being covered in black tar, and classrooms needing to be evacuated. And I say classrooms specifically because nearly every video I watched about this challenge was once again at school. A place where kids felt like they could just, light off bombs and get away with it, I guess. Beyond the obvious stupidity of this challenge, there's truly not much more to say besides, I suppose, the danger or craziness aspect of it, which really isn't too crazy compared to some of the things we're going to discuss, but there is a very real opportunity for danger when performing performing this challenge, as a full-blown house fire is an extremely likely outcome if only a few sparks went in the wrong direction. Now, fortunately, that wasn't the case in most instances, but that doesn't mean that numerous students were at least suspended, expelled, or even charged for arson as a result of this completely dumb prank. Honestly, there's not too much more to say about it because it is extremely simple, and it's my opinion that the reason that this trend took off was because it was so easy to perform, and the result was a rather dramatic visual display. However, the ends don't justify the means here, because as I stated, intentionally shorting an electrical supply, specifically in a public place, is not only dangerous, but it's also illegal. And some kids that were dumb enough to try this challenge learned one or both of those lessons the hard way. Oh, and I guess as a little bit of a bonus for this first section, there was also a similar challenge going on around the same time that was known as the Chromebook challenge. And all that this challenge involved was a school-provided Chromebook and a metal object. And how this challenge would be performed is you take your Chromebook, take your metal object, and put the metal object in the charge port of the Chromebook. And once again, similarly to the outlet challenge, the results were dramatic and in some cases outright dangerous. Videos online of people participating in this challenge show devices begin to spark, smoke, or in some cases even catch on fire. And these fires have reportedly melted charge ports, burnt desks, and generally done enough damage to the Chromebook itself and school property to charge students with property destruction, or in some cases, similar to the outlet challenge, arson. So yeah, like I said, this is one of the more tame challenges we're going to discuss, but it's no less brain dead. Because sure, making a fireball with a penny may seem cool, and it's definitely funny to see on a TikTok, but the reality of the situation after your 2 seconds of fame on TikTok ends is a much darker reality I hope none of you have experienced. Let's move on.
The door kicking challenge.
In the first section, we talked about people intentionally doing damage to public property. However, in this section, the door kicking challenge turns it up a notch, because in this very bright internet trend, what people do is intentionally damage private property, which not only comes with stricter repercussions, but also comes with a lot more danger, for reasons we'll get into. If you're watching this video and are a similar age to me, or probably any age, you likely at some point in your life have gone ding-dong ditching, or at least that's what we called it where I'm from. That pre-internet challenge consisted of going to somebody's house, knocking on the door, running away, hiding in a bush somewhere, and waiting for them to come outside for them to see, well, nobody at their door. And if you were extra crazy, you would do it once or twice more as well. And that was basically the extent of ding-dong ditching. Harmless, funny, but as an adult, I see how it is annoying. Although Ring cameras, I think, have more or less destroyed this entire hobby, which might be a good thing. Now, the door kick challenge differs a bit from ding-dong ditching, because in this internet trend, you're not simply knocking on somebody's front door. What you're doing is you're filming yourself donkey kicking someone's front door and running away. The major difference between these two activities, if you couldn't already tell, is that a donkey kick, A, does a lot more damage, B, is a lot more threatening to anybody inside the house, and C, filming yourself doing this only adds to the case going to be built against you once charges are inevitably laid. I honestly have no idea when knocking on the door became not enough and having to literally kick the door became the new standard for ding-dong ditching, but the fact that people not only upped the ante and also filmed themselves, to me, is once again mind-boggling. However, when you're discussing internet or TikTok trends, you're not necessarily discussing the brightest bunch. And while this trend may seem extremely simple, the repercussions are definitely not. Because since this trend had gained popularity in the late 2010s and early 2020s, videos have of course gone viral online, and gullible children who partook in this challenge got in some serious hot water. As of today, several teenagers have already faced criminal charges for participating in this brainless prank. And some of the charges that have been placed on kids trying to be funny or go viral are the following: trespassing, vandalism, and even attempted burglary. Those charges alone are nothing to play with. But on top of the legal repercussions that kids have faced from doing this challenge, you also have to recognize the possible violent repercussions from homeowners. I'm not sure where you're watching this video from in the world, but I know there's at least a handful of you that are watching this that are saying, if this happened at my house, the first thing I'm doing is grabbing my gun. And because this trend was popular in the United States, that was the reality for a lot of homeowners. Now, part of this trend was after you kick the door, you leave. So fortunately, there wasn't many violent altercations taking place. However, if you were taking place in the door kicking challenge and happened to still be in the sightline of somebody who was armed and assuming that you were trying to break into their home, you may be leaving that property with more holes than you entered with. And I'm not saying that's necessarily right or wrong, but I'm saying that that's just a fact. If you go to somebody's property at night, donkey kick their door, in some case literally breaking the lock and opening it, I wouldn't say it's unfair for a homeowner to assume their house is being broken into. Just imagine how terrifying that can be. In my case, I actually can. Before I even knew this challenge was a thing, I literally had been more or less of the victim of this prank. I was at one of my friends' houses. We were having a big event for one of my friend's birthdays. The house was probably full with 20 people, and near the end of the night, we were all sitting in his living room when we heard a massive bang at the front door. It was late at night, this bang was not normal, it wasn't windy out, and we knew something was seriously wrong. Me and all my friends stood up, instantly were terrified but assumed a position, and the first thing we did was go and check out the front door. Fortunately, the door was locked, we unlock it, we open it, and nobody was there. But we noticed a massive footprint on the front door. My first thought was that somebody tried to kick down the door, failed, and ran off. But my friend who owned the home said that this was likely a kid trying to pull a prank and not to worry about it. And then he pulled up his Ring camera, saw the footage of the kid donkey kicking the door and running away, and well, we had a bit of a laugh about it, but we were all still rather irritated and on edge for the rest of the night. I think I've already given the door kicking challenge too much time as it is because it is extremely simple and, well, I really don't need to explain how it's dumb and in some cases dangerous. But I will add a bit of a bonus as well, because similar to the door kicking challenge, there was also a similar trend that was going on, I feel like in 2023, 2024, known as the Kool-Aid Man challenge. In this challenge, you would typically run through somebody's fence, usually late at night, usually while drunk, and the sole goal was to break a hole in the fence and then move on with your day. For this trend, I didn't find too many examples of people filming themselves doing it. However, there is so many examples on security footage of people walking typically drunkenly down the sidewalk at night, seeing a fence, and then just deciding to run through it and continue on with their stroll. Unsurprisingly, this challenge, like the door kicking challenge, has also resulted in numerous charges being laid on teens and young adults thinking they're funny and getting a serious reality check.
The Tide Pod Challenge.
If you hadn't have heard of any of the other trends in this video so far, you've definitely heard of this one. And some of you may be thinking, the Tide Pod Challenge, that wasn't real, that was a joke. People didn't actually do that. And well, you're technically kind of right. The Tide Pod food meme definitely started with a satirical nature. People were posting pictures on Twitter and Reddit and other social medias of food with Tide Pods as a topping. Ironic and innocent enough. However, this joke quickly grew from fantasy to reality. Specifically, when people decided that, sure, a picture of it on a pizza is silly, but what if I actually tried to eat it? And this thought process and the eventual videos that came out of this thought process led to an internet trend that, well, unfortunately swept the nation. The Tide Pod Challenge itself initially started circulating in the late 2010s, unsurprisingly among kids who had seen other viral videos and aspired to make their own viral videos, specifically of eating a Tide Pod. These videos weren't only exclusive to TikTok, they were kind of everywhere: Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. They were being shared everywhere because of how ridiculous they were, and the whole point of the video was to kind of just film yourself trying to eat a Tide Pod and getting a reaction. Your face of how you were trying to chew it, your face when you actually had the flavor and the, well, detergent in your mouth, and the rather disgusting aftermath of trying to get detergent out of your mouth and hopefully not out of your stomach. Similar to the whole outlet challenge, I feel like this challenge really took off because of how accessible it was to anybody. Like, if you're a kid in your mom's basement and you just happen to be scrolling TikTok and you saw somebody with 1 million likes eating a Tide Pod and spitting it out, well, all you would have to do is to go in the laundry room, get a Tide Pod, film yourself doing it, and boom, you're just as cool as that guy. And it's, in my opinion, because of this ease of access that this entire trend became as big as it eventually did. And while this challenge may seem simple and innocent enough, the outcomes were anything but that. Taking a step backwards, you kind of have to understand that the reason why the Tide Pod Challenge was even viral in the first place was because Tide Pods were so obviously inedible and, well, toxic. Like, there was a reason there was no Apple Challenge because, well, biting into an apple and eating it is, well, normal. But swap that apple for a toxic Tide Pod and now you have some content. Tide Pods themselves may be bright colored, smell good, and look like candy. However, they were the furthest thing from that. And even small amounts of exposure from the chemicals within Tide Pods could lead to chemical burns, seizures, difficulty breathing, and even severe poisoning in extreme cases. It's been reported that between 2016 and 2020, in the United States alone, there was over 35,000 emergency room visits of children under the age of 18 due to the Tide Pod Challenge. And in 12.5% of those 35,000 cases, hospitalization was required. And I feel like that just kind of goes to show the power of scale. Because yeah, sure, it may seem innocent enough to some that, oh, I just bit this inedible thing, I spit it out, I took the video, that's it. But when you have millions of people doing it, even if only 0.1% of people have an extreme unfortunate incident, well, that still leads to thousands upon thousands of people, as we saw, in the hospital because of Tide Pods. The Tide Pod epidemic itself got so bad, in fact, that in 2018, New York State introduced legislation that aimed to ban candy-style detergent pods to prevent further damages to children. I really wish that was a joke, but unfortunately, that's a fact. And it's crazy to believe that legislators literally had to try to come up with an idea on how to prevent children from eating Tide Pods. And I suppose there is an argument to be made about, well, the Tide Pods looking candy-like, I suppose. But the reality is, the challenge and trend itself were undoubtedly the reason that so many vulnerable and gullible children were partaking and, unfortunately, in some cases, hurting themselves. And while we don't know the true extent of how many people in total have tried to consume a Tide Pod, the fact alone that there was 35,000 hospital visits associated with Tide Pods is enough information to know that this challenge was truly detrimental of the bored youth of the late 2010s.
The Fire Challenge.
If I told you that there was a viral internet trend that consisted of simply setting yourself on fire, would you believe me? Obviously not, right? This is obviously the digital equivalent of saying, hey, if your friends jumped off a bridge, would you too? It's a rhetorical question that has an obvious answer. No. But what if I told you that the Fire Challenge was unfortunately a very real and very viral internet trend? And it was exactly as dumb as it sounded. The Fire Challenge is actually one of the older internet trends that we've discussed so far. And the mainstream popularity of this trend kind of emerged in the early 2010s. The videos of people participating in this challenge were simple. Put something flammable on your hand, typically rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer, light it on fire, look at the cool flames, and then put it out. Obviously dumb, but seemingly simple enough. However, as we've already seen, results and outcomes may vary. In the early 2010s, the challenge started small, people putting a little bit of rubbing alcohol in the palm of their hand to light it, and then put it out. And as these videos gained popularity, people kept raising the ante more and more. Instead of putting rubbing alcohol in the palm of their hand, they would cover their entire hand. Instead of covering their entire hand, they would cover their arm in it. And it even got to the point where people were putting rubbing alcohol on their entire body, lighting themselves on fire for a TikTok, and then attempting to put themselves out, sometimes unsuccessfully. It's my belief once again that this challenge truly took off because of the reasons we've discussed previously. Similar to the Outlet Challenge, it was visibly dramatic, and similar to the Tide Pod Challenge, it was easily accessible. Any kid who was scrolling on Vine at the time or TikTok in the more modern times could watch somebody set themselves on fire and go, my mom has rubbing alcohol in the bathroom, she has a lighter beside her candle, I can do this right now and go viral. And unfortunately, that's what happened for a lot of kids. I'm sure at least some of you, and maybe even most of you, have seen videos online of people doing this challenge and unfortunately failing miserably, as there is a lot of viral videos of people partaking in this challenge and it just simply didn't go well. Fortunately, in most of these examples, these people at least had a quarter of a brain because they would perform this challenge in the shower. But even in those cases, it wasn't a foolproof plan. Because I can remember from memory a video of a guy in a shower covered in rubbing alcohol, setting himself on fire, and before he could even put himself out, he falls, knocks over the alcohol, sets the entire bathroom on fire, and just leaves the bathroom before even turning the shower on. And while you don't see the aftermath of that video, I can only imagine it was detrimental. Most of the viral videos surrounding the Fire Challenge don't show the outcome, but some of the more unfortunate results include severe burns, infections from those burns, permanent scarring, and in some cases, even death. And reported deaths have happened because of this challenge. One of the more recent examples took place in 2023, when an Arizona teen named Corey Lee suffered burns on more than half of his body as a result of the Fire Challenge. Corey specifically was trying to do a variation of the Fire Challenge known as the Fireball Challenge, where you don't even set yourself on fire, you simply try to create a homemade fireball. I truly don't think I need to go into too much more detail on why it's not smart and obviously dangerous to literally set yourself on fire, but I did want to add more context around the whole Fire Challenge because, believe it or not, this was a pretty widespread trend and it also has had resurgences over the last decade. And unfortunately, as we've seen, children are still dying in the 2020s due to the lack of education around these seemingly innocent but unfortunately deadly internet trends.
The Milk Crate Challenge.
This TikTok epidemic was likely the result of pandemic boredom. In case you've never heard of the Milk Crate Challenge, you don't have to eat a milk crate or you don't have to fit your body into a milk crate. The Milk Crate Challenge basically involves creating a sort of pyramid-based structure out of milk crates and then trying to cross it successfully. The challenge kind of blew up initially in 2021 on TikTok, and these viral videos showed people either successfully crossing super tall milk crate pyramids, or in most cases, getting about halfway up the pyramid only to then lose balance and have the entire milk crate pyramid fall over, and well, the video would end. These viral clips were funny to watch, seeming like just a regular fail video, somebody falling down, haha, whatever. But once again, with a desire for views comes upping the ante, and that's exactly what happened. The Milk Crate Challenge quickly grew bigger and bigger, with people building taller pyramids on more unsteady surfaces. And of course, with this increased danger in height, there was absolutely no increase in safety precautions, unfortunately leading to more virality, further feeding the beast. The Milk Crate Challenge, unlike some of the other challenges we've discussed, is a bit different because it's not necessarily only a feat of bravery, it's also a feat of physical endurance. To some, the milk crate challenge was nearly an Olympic-level display of balance, speed, precision, and ultimately stupidity. Because it's no secret that milk crates are not the most sturdy structure, especially when you stack them 10 tall and stand on them while moving relatively quickly. And of course, the result of this extremely viral and, well, extremely dumb challenge was the following. Between 2020 and 2021 alone, there was over 8,100 emergency room visits as a direct result from this trend. And the most common injury associated with this trend was concussions, broken bones, and even paralysis in extreme cases. While at a first glance, the milk crate challenge kind of just seems like a game show that you can build in your own backyard, you know, basically a mini redneck America's Ninja Warrior, absolutely nobody participating in this challenge got a prize. Unless you consider a concussion a prize. But I personally wouldn't. Interestingly, my whole philosophy of access doesn't necessarily apply here. At least, not in my personal experience. Because sure, it's easy enough to build a milk crate pyramid, but who has like 20, 30, 40, 50 milk crates? Maybe that's just a Canadian thing because we put our milk in bags, but I personally have never experienced in my childhood or adult life an abundance of milk crates or desire to climb them in an unsafe manner. I feel like to some people it may seem controversial to put the milk crate challenge as more crazy than the fire challenge, but the reason why I did this was because the fire challenge was at least obviously dumb and you would truly have to be hungry for attention or a brain to try it for yourself. However, the milk crate challenge seemed a bit more innocent. And I would argue that it's for that reason it ultimately resulted in more injuries and death, which is why, in my opinion, it's likely more crazy. But speaking of crazy, it's crazy that nearly 75% of you are watching this video right now and are not subscribed. We just hit 1 million subscribers, we post fire videos every Friday, and we're now on the road to 2 million subscribers. If you like the videos I make, well, be a bro and subscribe. Now let's get to our next challenge. The Blackout Challenge. At this point in the video, you're probably thinking to yourself, if they made a challenge called the Eat Poop and Jump Off the Roof Challenge, people would do it. And you're probably not wrong. However, I did want to show a bit of sympathy for this next challenge because although it is relatively obviously dangerous, it's also one of the more innocent seeming challenges that has led to the unfortunate demise of so many innocent children. The Blackout Challenge, or the choking game, might be the oldest challenge on this entire video and actually predates the entire internet itself. I'm going to be focusing on the Blackout Challenge specifically, although the choking game has a similar goal, similar execution, and similar outcome. The entire point of the Blackout Challenge is to restrict oxygen flow to the brain, specifically to feel a state of euphoria and to also nearly lose consciousness without fully losing it. In the pre-internet times during the choking game, people would typically do this with their friends to experience the feeling of having that restricted oxygen flow to the brain. However, in more recent times, people would do this with their friends and film it to gain popularity online to show the reaction to essentially losing consciousness and literally losing brain cells. How the Blackout Challenge would typically work is one person would essentially take a deep breath in while another person would simultaneously give them a strong bear hug from behind until that person passed out from a lack of oxygen. Typically, as a result of this lack of oxygen, people would fall over and act drunk for a few moments before regaining consciousness. And these videos would go viral specifically among young people because of how crazy the effects were. Now, here's the deal. Some young people watching these videos just thought it was cool to see somebody act so weird and thought it was, almost like a morbid curiosity. However, some young people were very curious to have this experience for themselves, seeing it almost as a way to get high without doing drugs or alcohol. And this is a major dangerous factor in this entire challenge because young people seeing people do this online gave them a false sense of security that, oh, I'll feel funny or dizzy, but I'll be fine right after. And everybody online's doing it, so I can do it. When in reality, it's actually that false sense of confidence that provides so much risk. Not necessarily to one individual particularly, but because, once again, with scale, more people are trying it, there's more opportunities for things to go wrong. And go wrong, they did. You see, believe it or not, oxygen deprivation in the brain is extremely dangerous. And even brief interruptions of oxygen in your brain can cause seizure, long-term brain damage, heart complications, and even death in more ways than one. With the most common cause of death being asphyxiation, however, the second most common cause of death was actually head injury. That's because in some cases, people trying this challenge would lose consciousness and then fall and hit their head, in some cases either causing instant death or an injury that resulted in death not long after, which is just heartbreaking. The whole Blackout Challenge has claimed victims as young as 10 years old, and it's simply all because people saw it online, they thought it was safe, they thought it was a way that they could just feel silly for a few moments, when in reality, it's not that you just feel dizzy and silly, you are literally depriving your most important organ of its most important nutrient. And sure, the videos online may seem silly, but attempting to do this yourself is literally putting putting your life at risk. However, the target audience of this challenge was for the most part unaware of that fact. And the results, as we've discussed and seen, have truly been unfortunate. And that's kind of one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to make this video. A, to discuss some truly ludicrous and just outrageous trends that people have actually done, and also to try to hopefully spread some awareness. If you see people doing something online that seems dangerous or looks dumb, it probably is, and you probably shouldn't do it. Actually, you know what? I'm just gonna say, in basically no case should you do something you see people doing online. Not to be grandpa bro, but if we've learned anything from this video, it's that, well, internet challenges are not your friend. And I guess before we get to the last entry of this video, I just want to say, if you guys have enjoyed this video about crazy internet trends, unfortunately, there is many more that I could discuss, and I obviously couldn't fit them all in one video. So if you guys want a part 2 to this video, leave a like below, or just leave a comment saying part 2, and I would be more than happy to make that video for you. But with that being said, let's move on to the last entry of this video.
The Kia Challenge.
So far in this video, we've discussed challenges that are either destructive to others' property or your personal body. But this final entry on this list is a challenge that does both. The Kia Challenge started on TikTok in roughly 2022, and it was started by a group of teenagers who later became known as the Kia Boys. And the Kia Boys went viral because they were posting videos of themselves seemingly non-stop of them breaking into Kia and Hyundai vehicles using simple tools, starting them in under a minute, and then joyriding them in the most dangerous and dumb ways. I'm assuming most of you have seen or at least heard of the Kia Boys, but if you haven't, well, you're in for a treat. Like I mentioned, in the early 2020s, it was discovered that almost every Kia and Hyundai model had a major flaw. There was no engine immobilizer, meaning that if you had very basic tools and, well, very basic knowledge, you could break into these cars, start them, and you had a brand new car at your disposal. And with how popular Kia and Hyundai models have been in recent years, the Kia Boys and anybody wanting to try the Kia Challenge basically had instant access to the focal point of this challenge. Obviously, when these videos started popping up on TikTok around 2022, they were going extremely viral because of how insane they were. Kids were breaking into random Kias, starting them within a minute, joyriding them in the most dangerous of ways, typically speeding, hanging out the side of them, ramming into their vehicles, and then just ditching them and doing it all again. Sometimes numerous times in the same night. Obviously, I don't think I need to go into excruciating detail on why people with no license driving stolen cars at reckless speeds in neighborhoods is dangerous to literally everybody, but well, in case you're missing part of your brain yourself, the biggest dangers associated with this challenge are, of course, danger to roadgoers, danger to pedestrians, danger to the people that are in the cars, whether they be the burglar or people that are simply friends with the burglar that simply thought a joyride could be fun. And on top of the potential loss of life or injury that could be caused out of the stupidity, of course, we have property damage. Obviously, we have the individual that is likely just trying to get by who has just had their car damaged and stolen, but we also have all of the property damage caused by these joyrides that typically hit other vehicles, street signs, power poles, mailboxes, you name it, a Kia Boy, Kia car has hit it. And it seemed like in 2022, there was simply no stopping the Kia Boys, and these videos were viral. Not only videos from the Kia Boys themselves, but also videos of people trying it, news clips of the news covering the Kia Boys, and even interviews with the Kia Boys from different YouTubers. The whole Kia Boys trend and phenomenon became so popular that even TikTok got backlash for even hosting the content of these people doing it. And this trend was simply one of those trends that, while it's crazy to assume that somebody can be inspired to just steal a car by watching a video, because of how viral and prevalent this whole trend and phenomenon was, there was a massive spike of Grand Theft Autos during this time, which led to a plethora of viral videos, a plethora of injuries, a handful of deaths, and ultimately massive reform for automakers to ensure that this would never happen again. I think the overarching theme on this entire video is the fact that, sure, it may be interesting or shocking or even funny to see one of these videos online, somebody eating a Tide Pod or setting themselves on fire or falling off a milk crate. But what I really wanted to highlight in this video is that, sure, the 5 seconds you see may be shocking or funny or crazy, but the reality of that situation is much more dangerous than you could ever assume. Not only because the person you saw in that video might be permanently injured, but also because the video that you saw and thought was funny, somebody else saw and thought was inspiring. And well, their lack of education and misplaced inspiration could have led to serious bodily harm.
Common habits that are signs of high intelligence. Late night insight.
It's 10 p.m. on a school night. You've done all your homework, maybe you've done all your work. You've played video games with your friends, you've done everything you could possibly do in the day, and for some reason, you still don't feel like going to bed. It's completely reasonable to be going to bed at this time, and honestly, it would save you a lot of headache in the morning. Although for some reason, you decide to opt out of sleeping and stay up a few more hours just to enjoy a little bit of late night solitude. On a surface level, this may seem like an irresponsible decision, primarily being motivated by a lack of discipline or potentially a lack of respect for sleep. However, in some cases, that's truly not the case. And what this odd late-night choice actually represents is something you might not expect. Now, I would say that most people watching this video would probably associate waking up early and starting your day with a strong routine, or at least at an early hour, would represent high intelligence because you are taking initiative in starting your day early, signaling proactivity and, of course, intention. Although, according to recent studies, that's actually not the case, and at least when it comes to brain function, opting to stay up late has been strongly correlated with higher intelligence. And I'm not just making this up to make myself feel better, because it might not be a surprise that being a YouTuber, my sleep schedule is not necessarily ideal. According to numerous scientific studies that have been conducted, people that are more likely to stay up late rather than wake up early show more of a specific type of intelligence that has been linked to prestigious jobs and higher incomes. Which is definitely an interesting metric, although money doesn't necessarily equate to intelligence per se. But of course, that isn't the only study. I just thought it was interesting. The University of Madrid, for example, did an in-house study on nearly 1,000 teenagers. And the sole goal of the study was to determine the sleep patterns of these students and then correlate that sleep pattern with their test results. Out of those nearly 1,000 students, 25% of them classified themselves as a morning person, and 32% of them classified themselves as a night owl. Oh, and the other roughly 50% didn't feel like they qualified in either of the groups, so they were just kind of neutral sleepers. Regardless, once they had the sleep patterns of every one of these participants, they then went on to track their academic output. And how this was tracked was the university would monitor the final grades for each of these students in major subjects. Math, science, writing, stuff like that. Unsurprisingly, the results of this study showed that participants that stayed up later or were night owls scored higher than morning types across the board, specifically on inductive reasoning. Now, inductive reasoning is an interesting metric to note because it has been shown to be one of the best estimates of general intelligence, and it is also one of the strongest predictors of academic performance. That, to me, is super interesting, and honestly makes a lot of sense, because I feel like if you try to compare it apples to apples and just say, oh, well, people that stay up late are better at math than people that wake up early, it doesn't really paint the full picture. Being gifted in math really only demonstrates one sort of intelligence, while inductive reasoning kind of covers general intelligence, which could apply to any subject. So for that reason, I think inductive reasoning is a smart variable, although it's also something I've never heard before, so I guess we're all learning today. But of course, these weren't the only studies to suggest that people that stayed up late were potentially more intelligent, or at least had better inductive thinking skills. The US Air Force, for example, did a study on their recruits, and what they found was that their night owl recruits were significantly more able to think laterally than their early bird recruits, even in morning meetings, which kind of just adds insult to injury because morning time is literally the natural habitat of early risers. Interestingly, throughout all of the studies that have been taken place on people that wake up early versus staying up late, there has been one commonality that has been associated with both sleepers, that being personality types. It has been suggested by Professor Jim Horn of Loughborough University that people that stay up late are more likely to be extroverted creative types, typically artists or inventors. And morning people, for example, are more likely to be logical and are often seen in logical jobs like accounting. Now, while all of this information is interesting and at least personally affirming, it's also not an end-all be-all. There is no right sleep routine besides the one that feels most natural to you and fits your lifestyle most. And just because you wake up early, it doesn't mean you're any less smart than somebody who stays up late. Specifically because you could be night owl brained, but your job simply doesn't allow for that. Although, if you do find yourself typically tending to stay up late at night, that just might be a sign that you have high intelligence. Or insomnia, and in that case, I would see a doctor. Teddy bear intellect. Have you ever given your car a nickname, felt bad for knocking over a stuffed animal, or maybe just had a strong emotional attachment to any inanimate object? Well, you might be smarter than you think, at least in a certain capacity. I would argue that there's likely two groups of people watching this video right now. One group of people that have at least a few core items from their childhood that they refuse to ever give up. A blanket, a stuffed animal, or something of the sort. While the other group had absolutely no issue destroying every shred of their childhood as soon as they hit puberty. Neither of these approaches to life are necessarily wrong, although they do signal different things. In the first example I gave, having a strong emotional connection to items you grew up with, this connection to inanimate objects has actually been associated with elevated emotional intelligence. And in some cases, this emotional connection with this object is considered to be anthropomorphism, which is essentially when you project either human emotions or attributes onto an object or animal. And there is a lot of famous examples of anthropomorphism in pop culture. For example, the movie Cars, or Lion King, or literally any movie where there is a character that is non-human but has human traits. This anthropomorphic trend in media is not necessarily by mistake either, and that's because anthropomorphism is typically associated with people that have high levels of empathy and also high levels of creativity, making it no surprise that the people that are giving you a movie about, well, talking cars are also some of the most talented animators and storytellers working in creative professions. Now, in my opinion, this sort of elevated emotional empathy and intelligence, while awesome, does come with its own downsides, specifically making a lot of things in life harder. When you find yourself gaining some sort of attachment to almost every object in your life, it makes moving on or downsizing a lot more complicated. And as we've seen, extreme versions of this mindset actually lead to some pretty horrendous situations. You know, the type of stuff you see on TLC. For example, the show Hoarders is all about people who are so attached to objects, and in a lot of cases, hoarding becomes dangerous, if not downright deadly. And it's believed in those extreme cases such as hoarding that these people are suffering from long-term mental trauma, and they're trying to use objects to fill a void that they have emotionally in their heart, which is very unfortunate. Another different extreme that I would have to assume operates on the same mental function would be that one guy that would like kiss and, have fun with his car. He had more than an emotional relationship with that vehicle, and I would have to assume that the part of his brain that is, well, responsible for separating the line between people and objects was completely blurred, leaving him in a sexual relationship with a vehicle. So yeah, if you ever find yourself feeling extra sentimental about a trinket, a toy, or something of the sort, and either you can't live without it or you get very upset if you lose something that, well, seemed meaningless, you're not a baby and you're not broken. You are more likely just sensitive and have a higher emotional intelligence. Your brain has a strong capacity for memory, and it applies these strong memories and emotional meanings with different things. And most of the time, the meaning of this object has nothing to do with the object itself. For example, let's say your grandfather passed away and he left you a fishing rod. This fishing rod might have so much meaning to you and you could never live without it. Now, from a functional perspective, you may have never fished in your life and you don't like fishing and you never will fish. That doesn't affect the way you feel about this rod because you've associated memories and emotions to it, making it something you now have an attachment to. And that's okay. And it's also not a form of materialism. It's a form of your brain trying to express how it feels in a way that is tangible to, well, you. So yeah, it's okay to have an emotional connection to your items, and it's also okay not to. If you're the type of person who has no sentimental bone in your body and you could throw away anything in an instant, that is also in a way a superpower because you are not weighed down by any of the things that these extra sensitive people are. And as I want to make clear once again, there is no right or wrong. There are simply different people with different brains. And in the case of sentimentality, it has been shown that people that find themselves closely attached to objects often have a higher emotional intelligence, and that is pretty interesting. Fiction intuition. Have you ever been reading your favorite fictional fairy tale or potentially your favorite romantic novel, only to be told by somebody rudely implying that reading fiction is a waste of time because it's not real and therefore not educational? If you have, I feel your pain. And fortunately, I've got some good news for you. Recent studies suggest that reading fiction isn't only not a waste of time, it's actually a sign of, you guessed it, high intelligence. And before we get into that, I want to quickly note too that reading in general is probably a good indicator of intelligence. And it's something that most of us probably don't do enough. At least I know I don't. And I guess that's more of a 2026 problem, not enough people are reading, but I do believe that holding a physical book and reading is good for your mind and probably a sign of intelligence. Regardless, the reason why fiction is so strongly associated with a high intelligence is because what fiction demands. Unlike reading non-fiction books, fiction requires the reader to imagine scenes, interpret emotions, follow detailed plot points, and even understand characters' motives and intentions. While reading a detailed fictional story, the brain is consistently trying to predict outcomes, connect past events, and make sense of subtle clues hidden within the dialogue. The habit of reading this and seeking out this sort of material proves that your brain is not only able to handle it, but thrives off of it. And interestingly, it's been shown that reading fiction books strengthens reading comprehension, memory, abstract thinking, and is thought to generally improve your higher cognitive ability. Meaning that not only is reading fiction a habit of somebody with high intelligence, but it is literally a habit that could also increase your intelligence as well, making it something that literally everybody can benefit from, which is really cool. Now, it might sound counterintuitive to suggest that reading books in your room alone can increase your social skills, but some studies have also suggested that that may be the case. And the reason for this is something I've kind of already alluded to. Fiction can increase your emotional intelligence and social skills because as you're reading stories with detailed characters, you are mentally building empathy for their situations, understanding the social dynamics between different characters, and in most cases, developing an ability to understand complex human behaviors by being able to almost see it from a third-person perspective, something that books and media are able to do in a unique way. I mean, you could probably do this in real life as well too, but you have to basically be watching people have conversations and just be eavesdropping a lot to get the same benefit. And even then, you wouldn't get as much context as, well, a book would give you. But on top of just the demanding nature of most fiction novels, as well as the exercise in emotional intelligence, there is also the mental benefit of simply holding your attention on something that is, well, demanding for a long amount of time. Most fiction readers are not reading their book for 5 or 10 minutes. They're long-haul readers, at least the ones that I've met. And these long sessions require patience, imagination, and literal mental endurance. And people who are able to focus for a long amount of time and concentrate on things like plot points, themes, and symbolism, as well as character development, show obvious signs of cognitive strength and stamina, which is kind of amazing. And while some may still make the argument that, well, fiction has no real-world application, the reality is, it really does, just not in a direct way. Sure, a business book can show you how to potentially grow or run a business, but fiction can help expand your mind in a way that will literally allow you to benefit all aspects of your life by having a more finely tuned brain and potentially even better social skills and emotional intelligence. And while your results and strengths may vary, the science is pretty conclusive that reading in general is great, and fiction reading has some pretty unique benefits that I personally was pretty unaware of. And I guess with that, score 1 for the nerds.
The messy megamind.
Whether it be at school or at work, I'm sure you've come across one of two groups of people in your travels. The first group of people, either at work or school, keeps their desk in immaculate condition. Pencils lined up the right way, at a perfect angle, no shavings on the desk, papers perfectly in order, and the general workspace is as pristine as can be. Now, on the complete opposite side, the other individual has a desk that looks like a nuclear bomb just went off. Papers are seemingly put everywhere, pencils are all over the place. The pencils themselves are more of nubs and shreds than actual pencils, and there truly seems to be no rhyme or reason for anything in this workspace. If I were to ask you, out of these two individuals, which one is likely to have a higher intelligence, what would you say? While the neat desk would likely seem like the obvious choice, I'm sure the now unsurprising answer is the opposite. According to studies, it is a known fact that highly intelligent people typically don't prioritize neatness when it comes to their workplace. Their brains are typically more focused on deeper, more meaningful tasks, and for that reason, cleanliness is usually pushed to the bottom of the totem pole. In a majority of cases, having a slightly messy desk isn't a sign of laziness whatsoever. It's a reflection of having a busy, active mind that places creativity and problem solving above, well, cleanliness and busy work. And the thesis behind the study was that a strict, orderly desk or workspace encourages the person at the desk to think conventionally, within the lines, and make safe, rational decisions, which definitely has a time and place. Although it's also suggested that people with a slightly messy desk are more likely to think out of the box, more unconventionally, and for that reason, more creatively, which also has its own perks and benefits. It's believed that for some people with high IQ, their work is typically done in bursts of passion and deep concentration, meaning that during these literal brain blasts, workspace cleanliness is not even a thought in their mind. And by the time that their task or work session is complete, they typically don't have the mental energy to go ahead and clean their desk. At least, not usually, but everybody's different. And while this may just seem like a cope to some people, there is true validity behind the thought process. It is a historically documented fact that Einstein, for example, had a famously messy desk. And interestingly, he has even gone on record saying, quote, "If a cluttered desk is a sign of a cluttered mind, of what then is an empty desk a sign?" Obviously suggesting that, yes, if your desk is cluttered, your mind is cluttered, you're thinking, you're being active. However, if your desk is empty and clean and prim and proper, maybe your mind is, well, clean, but empty as well. Obviously a bit biased and sarcastic, but I definitely think he has a point with this whole quote. Now, throughout this section, I have been mentioning slightly messy because there is a level between, well, like we've talked about, slightly messy and complete disasters. And there is a major difference between the two. And similar to the whole hoarder example I mentioned earlier, I don't think that you can apply this mindset to a hoarder house and say, wow, that person must be extremely smart because their entire house is a disgusting mess. That's obviously not the case, and is a sign of not high intelligence per se, but potentially of mental illness. Regardless, a lot of the studies done on, well, this messiness specifically relates to desks, although I do think this whole theory could be applied to other environments, such as bedrooms, studios, and other potentially creative places. Interestingly, a big reason why a lot of these messy environments stay messy is because to the person who created them, this is controlled chaos. And while to an outsider, your desk full of pencils and papers everywhere makes no sense, to you, you know exactly where everything is. You know that under that second piece of paper, there is the perfect pencil you like to write with. And you know that under that stained textbook is, well, the best calculator known to man. And even though it looks like there's just random scraps of paper everywhere, you know that each one of those pieces of paper actually contains important information relevant to something you're working on. And for that reason, if in your eyes, your workplace seems to be, well, at least orderly enough for you to know where everything is, why would you clean it if you could already operate functionally? You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And while I would definitely say there's a time and place to organize things and keep a certain level of cleanliness in your life and in your professional workplace, it's definitely interesting to see the scientific correlations between intelligence and, well, messiness in your workplace. But I'm also kind of curious if this entire study was done by scientists that were getting scolded for having a dirty lab. And instead of cleaning or hiring a janitor, they just decided to do a whole study proving that, well, actually, they're so smart they need a raise because their lab is dirty. But what do I know?
The sleepy genius.
As a child, naps are a normal and crucial part of life. Although, as an adult, naps take on a different role, a more divisive role. For me personally, I am definitely not one for naps, and if I'm up, I'm up. And the only time I sleep is when I am down for the night. Although, it's not lost on me that there is a large group of the population that simply love their beauty sleep, and they will get as much as they possibly can. Even if they can only get 5 minutes on the couch, 2 minutes on the bus, 10 hours in their bed, 30 seconds at their desk, whatever sleep they can get, they will. And while to me the endless sleep-wake cycle sounds pretty horrible, according to science, the habit of taking a midday nap is not only a sign of unemployment, but also of high intelligence. I guess from a bird's eye view, it kind of makes sense, right? Like, as a baby, naps and sleep in general are massive for both body and brain development. Why not try to maximize those benefits as an adult as well? Jokes aside, obviously there is a lot of reasons for napping as an adult. Unique work schedules, illness, sleep disorders, and of course, high intelligence. And in the context of high intelligence, the reason why napping isn't an uncommon hobby is kind of interesting. People with high IQs are consistently processing information, analyzing details, and forming complex ideas, at least in the context of work. And because of this high mental activity causes a lot of cognitive energy drain, making you feel extremely fatigued, typically in not too long of a time, depending on how demanding the work is and your baseline energy. This combination of demanding work and also drained energy can leave you feeling extremely fatigued, even if you haven't done anything particularly physical, which is why some people opt to nap. A brief nap, even a 5 to 10 minute power nap, allows your brain to reorganize information, reset its focus, and recover from heavy mental load. And with unique techniques and specific intentions, you can make a significant amount of progress in your mental bandwidth with only a short amount of time if you know what you're doing. These intentional naps can also almost be categorized as meditation, which kind of has a similar effect. If you are doing work or participating in a situation that requires a heavy mental load, at some point your brain is going to feel fatigued and you are literally going to be, well, mentally burned out. This is something that we've all felt, and some of us carry this feeling for the rest of the day or even the rest of the week, depending on how severe it is. Although it's been shown that intentionally napping or even meditating in some cases during the day can intentionally reset your brain, essentially clearing its cache, freeing up more space to do more thought-provoking work. And I think it's important to note that your brain is a powerhouse and requires a lot of energy. And on a daily basis, your brain typically burns anywhere from 400 to 500 calories per day. And if you're familiar with exercise and fitness, then you know how much energy and output it requires to burn 500 calories. So just applying that to your brain on a daily basis without moving, it's insane to think about how much work your brain is doing on, well, the inside. Now, just like reading fiction novels, napping can increase your intelligence even if the nap or reading session wasn't triggered by your high intelligence. And that's because that research shows that even a brief nap shows significant improvement in memory retention, logical thinking, decision-making, and creativity. Meaning that this is something that you can actively experiment with and try implementing into your creative process if you ever end up feeling burnt out or simply stuck on an idea or problem. It may sound counterintuitive, but the next time you're really stuck on some work, try not thinking harder about it, but literally going to sleep on it. Not all night, but set an alarm for 15 or 20 minutes and see how you feel afterwards. Now, there's a chance that you might just end up feeling groggy and worse for wear, which isn't necessarily uncommon, although if you are one of the individuals that benefits from a short nap, then definitely take advantage of the, well, boost you can get from this nap. Because a good nap is really the closest thing we have to an all-natural, healthy, organic, creativity-boosting, brain-boosting pill. And the best part is, it's free. So yeah, even though there's a plethora of reasons of why adults nap, the reality is that no matter what the situation is, napping does have a net positive effect on your cognitive function, and people with high intelligence are more inclined to nap during the day due to the mental stress that they are typically under with demanding work or even default thought processes. So the next time you see your drunk uncle passed out on the couch at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, don't judge him for being lazy. Understand that that man is a genius who knows how to make math. Like, that's impressive. That's science right there. He's literally the next Einstein. Just look at his desk. It's a mess too. Seeking information. If you watch the Trusty Bro YouTube channel, it's because you like to learn about interesting things. And luckily for you, I make videos about interesting things every single week. And did you know that it's scientifically proven, because I said so right now, that watching a Trusty Bro video is actually a sign of high intelligence? Because if you're seeking out new information, that means that you have a mind that is, well, wanting to learn and grow. And if you ask me for my completely unbiased opinion, that makes you sound like a genius in my books. So, if you like learning and you like the fun format of, well, my videos, feel free to subscribe and become a bro. We're on the road to 2 million subscribers, and believe it or not, nearly 75% of you guys watching this are not even subscribed. And at this point, you might be asking yourself, wait, was this whole section just to get a subscription? And the answer is yes. And the reason you figured that out is because you're a genius, which kind of bolsters my theory that people that watch Trusty Bro are just natural geniuses. Subscription shilling aside, let's actually move on. Background noise brainiac. Let me paint a picture. You're tired, you want to go to bed, but you just can't sleep without putting on the right background noise. Maybe it's rain sounds. Maybe it's a Trust Me Bro compilation. Maybe it's anything. But you know you're not going to get a good night's sleep without your background noise. Let me paint another picture. You know that you have to lock in on a lot of work. Maybe it's schoolwork, maybe it's your career. Regardless, you've got a lot on your plate, but you are just struggling to lock in. That is, until you put on the right binaural beats or brown noise, and all of a sudden, you are simply ready to lock in. I don't know about you, but for me, this is one that I definitely relate to, because having the right background noise can definitely take my focus from a 0 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10 with simply a few clicks on YouTube. With background noise specifically, some highly intelligent people use background noise because it helps their brain function at an optimal level with the right sensory input. For some people, believe it or not, complete silence can actually be distracting, and in some cases, even unnatural feeling. And this is because some intelligent minds are just racing at times, meaning that when they are exposed to silence, they are actually exposed to a plethora of previously unheard thoughts. Now, with some background noise, like some soft music, binaural beats, ambient noise, or whatever it may be, you can effectively regulate your brain's mental activity by providing just enough mental stimulation to keep your brain engaged without overwhelming it. And there's a fine line there, because I've definitely noticed that if I use the wrong content to try to regulate my brain, and which for me is typically anything with more than one person talking, I notice that I actually don't focus more, I get more distracted. But that's just me. Maybe I'm not able to, compute all of that input. Regardless, using background noise to help you focus essentially helps you get into a cognitive flow state, which will help boost your focus, productivity, and problem-solving abilities. So, if you're somebody who consistently finds himself putting on background noise, whether it be in a work environment, a sleep environment, or even just a chill environment to keep your brain stimulated, it's likely because your brain is more powerful than you even know. And the reason why you're putting on this background noise is to subconsciously regulate your brain, because silence for you can sometimes be overwhelming because of how active your brain is, which is definitely interesting. And if this is eye-opening for you, then I want to share a few tips. A lot of what we learned in this video kind of shows that your brain can definitely be powerful, but also in a negative way if you don't learn to control it. Which is why this is not necessarily part of the video, but I just really want to recommend 2 things that have really helped me. One, I mentioned it earlier, look up binaural beats or brown noise on YouTube. There's a bunch of different frequencies you can listen to that actually are proven to help your brain. Brown noise is a different type of frequency that literally kind of turns off mental clutter. It's similar to white noise, but it's brown. I don't know what the difference is, but I just prefer brown noise. And beyond that, I just want to say, if you actively find yourself being overstimulated, like I am right now, to be quite frank, or feel yourself overwhelmed with life and thoughts and tasks and work, let me recommend one habit: meditation. I know it sounds like woo-woo and it's hard to do, but literally just go on YouTube and look up 5-minute meditation or guided meditation, or even watch a tutorial on how to meditate. Understand that if you've been watching this video and you feel like you may have a high intelligence based off of some of the things I've said, then I would suggest trying to form a better relationship with your newly discovered powerful brain and super intelligence. Because realistically, your brain can be your biggest asset and also potentially your worst enemy. But maybe that's a video I can make another time, because I also had the idea for a video about things that are actually signs of mental illness. So if you would like to see that video or a part 2 to this video, let me know in the comments.
The craziest heist that actually worked. The Mona Lisa mystery.
In October of 2025, only 5 months ago from the date of recording this video, the famous French museum, the Louvre, was robbed for over 88 million pounds in jewelry. The entire heist only took 8 minutes, and out of those 8 minutes, thieves only spent 4 within the museum itself. This heist took place in daylight hours, and almost immediately after it happened, it made national headlines, and I'm assuming that most of you remember hearing about it, at least in some capacity. As of right now, charges have been filed against 5 suspects in relation to that robbery. However, the whereabouts of those missing jewels are still unknown to this very day. And while that heist is recent and noteworthy, it's actually not the heist I'm going to be discussing. Because, believe it or not, it's not the most expensive or most significant robbery that's taken place at the Louvre. And in my opinion, the most expensive and significant heist that took place at the Louvre actually dates all the way back to 1911, when the Louvre experienced its first documented heist, which resulted in the Mona Lisa being stolen for years.
Let me paint a picture for you. No pun intended.
Vincenzo Perugia was born on October 8th, 1881 in Italy. He spent his childhood and young adult life living in a small village on the border of Italy and Switzerland. But due to a lack of local career opportunities, Vincenzo decided to move to Paris. And quickly, he was able to secure work. Vincenzo picked up a job at the Louvre, possibly one of the most iconic landmarks in all of Paris, if not all of France. And while his job was modest and simple, he was still able to play a significant role in the institution. Vincenzo's job primarily consisted of cleaning and framing paintings, as well as constructing strong cases for some of the more expensive artwork. One notable piece being the Mona Lisa. Vincenzo, unfortunately, didn't hold this job for long, and from 1908 to 1911, he ended up working different odd jobs around Paris. That was until the summer of 1911, when he decided to do the job of a lifetime. Fed up with doing random construction jobs around Paris, Vincenzo wanted to make a big sum of money. And he also wanted to do something patriotic for his country. And he decided the best way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone was by using his expertise to steal the Mona Lisa and then bring it back to Italy, where he could sell it and return it to its rightful country of origin. But we'll get to that. On August 20th, 1911, Vincenzo entered the Louvre only minutes before it closed. He was dressed in what was known as a traditional smock, and it was essentially a white lab coat that Louvre employees would wear. Vincenzo knew this from working there previously and was able to get almost an exact replica, something that would come in handy later on. Since he entered the Louvre so late, he knew he only had minutes to try to find the perfect hiding spot before he would be asked to leave. And once again, because of his experience working there, he was able to quickly find a closet and set up camp for the night. The following morning at 7 a.m., August the 21st, Vincenzo awoke from his likely uncomfortable storage closet slumber and began to execute on his plan. Immediately after exiting the closet, he was met with nobody. And that's because this Monday, like every Monday during the summer at the time, the Louvre was closed, which meant that security and foot traffic were at an all-time low. By 7:15 a.m., Vincenzo had made his way to the Salon Carré, the room where the Mona Lisa and other notorious paintings were held. That's right, believe it or not, there was a time when the Mona Lisa did not have its own special room. Regardless, due to his experience working with these exact paintings, Vincenzo was able to quickly and expertly remove the Mona Lisa off the wall and bring it to a secluded staircase where he could remove it from its frame, the very frame he was very likely involved in the construction of, explaining why he was able to so quickly and expertly, once again, remove the painting from the frame. So far, every aspect of his plan had gone off without a hitch. He covered the painting with his white smock and tucked them both under his arm, as if it was a free newspaper. And to Vincenzo, this plan almost seemed too easy. That was until he tried to leave the Louvre. As he tried to use the exit in the stairway, he was met with one major problem: a locked door. Vincenzo had no keys to the Louvre, and because he stayed overnight and this was the day the Louvre was closed, there was likely only locked doors surrounding the entire premises, meaning he was potentially locked in there until the following day. However, almost instantly after all hope had seemed lost, Vincenzo was met with his saving grace. A plumber making his way down the staircase just so happened to notice Vincenzo looking perplexed at the locked back door. And this plumber, wanting to be polite and assuming this employee was simply struggling with a door, offered to unlock the door for him and allow him to go about his day. A gesture that Vincenzo accepted gratefully. After being let out of the Louvre with the Mona Lisa hidden under his arm only minutes after emerging from the storage closet, Vincenzo was on his way back to his apartment with one of the most iconic pieces of art ever made. And one of the craziest parts is, no one was the wiser for over 24 hours. And that's because the following day when the Louvre reopened, a photography session was taking place for a majority of the Louvre's art, meaning a lot of art was being taken on and off the wall all day. And for that reason, people simply assumed that the Mona Lisa was being photographed. However, the following day, when the Mona Lisa was the only piece of art to not be returned after being photographed, people started to become concerned. And it quickly became obvious that somebody had stolen the Louvre's girl. Once the museum made the official decision to declare the Mona Lisa stolen, they contacted authorities, and almost instantly detectives were at the scene, and the national border of France started being closely monitored to ensure no trafficking of the painting outside of the country. However, even with that measure being taken, the search for the Mona Lisa quickly became a global pursuit, and the reward for information that would lead to the recovery of the Mona Lisa quickly rose to over $250,000. After the public was informed that the Mona Lisa was stolen and that there was a major cash prize for any information potentially leading to its recovery, the authorities were bombarded with an overwhelming amount of tips, all essentially contradicting each other, leaving almost no recognizable patterns for authorities to work off of. However, that doesn't mean they didn't have any suspects. While the authorities at this point were essentially questioning anybody that had almost any relationship to the Louvre, two notable suspects were Pablo Picasso and Vincenzo himself. Pablo Picasso was a notable suspect simply because he was a known art thief, or at least a purchaser of stolen art. Somebody who had stolen statues from the Louvre in the past admitted that they had stolen statues from the Louvre and sold them to Pablo Picasso. And when authorities investigated these claims, they were able to find that, yes, the same statues that this individual had claimed to stolen and sold were currently in Pablo Picasso's home. And it was for that reason that he was heavily questioned by the police. However, they were not convinced he had any involvement, which led them to question every employee of the Louvre, past and present, which led them to Vincenzo. However, even though he was a suspect, he was not a prime suspect, simply because his employment there was brief and not necessarily high level. And each time that the authorities talked to him, he made a convincing case that he had no idea what was going on and he had no involvement whatsoever. Little did the investigators know that every time they entered Vincenzo's apartment, they were literally within smelling distance of the Mona Lisa. And that's because Vincenzo had hidden the Mona Lisa in the bottom of a chest he kept in his apartment and then covered it with a false floor to make it look like an empty chest. However, that empty chest just so happened to contain a piece of art that is now worth over $1 billion. But we'll get to that. For over 2 years after the heist, Vincenzo lived a normal life, keeping the Mona Lisa just sitting in a trunk in his apartment. However, after these 2 years, he was fed up with having it sitting there doing nothing, and he decided it was time to return the painting to his homeland, a place he believed the painting belonged. And not for no reason either. Leonardo da Vinci did paint the Mona Lisa in Florence, Italy. However, the Mona Lisa wasn't stolen from Italy by Napoleon as Vincenzo thought. In reality, the Mona Lisa was actually gifted to King Francis I by Leonardo da Vinci when he moved to France 250 years before Napoleon was ever even born. Regardless, Vincenzo wrote an anonymous letter to an art dealer in Florence offering them the real Mona Lisa. And while skeptical, this art dealer invited Vincenzo to meet him in Florence in a hotel. And Vincenzo traveled with his trunk from Paris to Florence, where he met with the dealer in the hotel, showed him the Mona Lisa, and tried to conduct a deal. The art dealer told Vincenzo that his patriotic move was very much so appreciated. And while he wanted to make a deal, he needed to ensure the painting was authentic first. And for that reason, he had to get it examined by his team. Vincenzo accepted these terms and waited in his hotel, only for there to be a knock on the door only an hour later. Although this wasn't a quick approval of authenticity, it was the police who came to arrest Vincenzo. You see, once the art dealer successfully had the Mona Lisa in his possession, he decided to contact authorities, which they were eager to respond, and Vincenzo was promptly arrested. Although, even though the scale of his crime was massive, his punishment was relatively small. He ended up only spending 7 months in prison, and it's reported that he was given a lighter sentence due to his patriotic intentions with the painting. However, in recent times, experts actually question whether or not he was trying to be patriotic or simply using that as an excuse. Because Vincenzo wasn't trying to donate the painting to an Italian museum, he was trying to sell it to an Italian art dealer, meaning he was at least partially motivated by profit as well. Regardless, if you wanted to know what it was like to steal the world's most important and expensive painting, here you go. Although, be warned, the Louvre has slightly more security than it did over 100 years ago. And with its massive increase in value, the Mona Lisa has also been given much more stringent security measures. And I don't think that doing some sort of night at the museum style sleepover and costume would kind of get you the same results in 2026. Regardless, this simple heist was likely successful because of its simplicity, and in my opinion, undoubtedly had a massive impact on history, at least in the realm of art heists. But with that being said, let's move on to a classic bank heist.
The Northern Bank Heist. It is December 19th, 2004.
Chris Ward is spending time with his family in his house in Northern Ireland. Chris Ward works for the Northern Bank, and being in the middle of the holiday season has made his work extremely stressful, making any time he's able to spend with his family that much more precious. Although this night was unlike any other night he's ever had with his family, because during the time simply watching soccer, or I guess football, Chris receives a knock on the door. However, it wasn't Christmas carolers looking to sing for him and his family. It was a man saying he wanted to discuss football. However, after letting this man in, and then two mysterious men following this man into his home, the true intentions of these strangers were almost instantly revealed. The strangers, now intruders in Chris's home, instantly draw weapons, point them directly at his family, and tell Chris that they know he works at the Northern Bank, and they're going to use his access to rob the bank. And if he doesn't want to help cooperate, his entire family is going to die. Terrified and not wanting to end the lives of everybody he loves, Chris follows the orders of these men, and they tell him that he needs to collect his work clothes immediately and get into the car waiting outside. The men inform Chris that they are going to stay behind and watch his family, and they reassure him that as long as he follows every single one of their commands, his family will remain alive. However, if he disobeys the gunmen, his family will pay the price. Not left with many options, Chris collects his work uniform and enters the vehicle outside, where the driver points another gun at Chris and takes him to a secluded location. While Chris Ward is being held hostage in a vehicle en route to who knows where, his supervisor at the Northern Bank, Kevin McCullen, has experienced a similar situation. Two men knocked on Kevin's door pretending to be police officers. They ask him to quickly step outside regarding a family situation, and as soon as Kevin steps outside, he is met with a gun in the face, and both him and his wife are quickly apprehended. Kevin's wife is blindfolded and taken away by one of the men, and Kevin is told that she is going to be taken to a safe location, and in 24 hours, if he does everything they say, he will return her to him completely unharmed. At that point, Kevin's wife is taken away, Kevin is restrained in his spare room, and Chris just so happens to arrive at this secluded location, aka Kevin's house, although in a separate room. Eventually, both Kevin and Chris were brought into the living room of Kevin's apartment, and the mastermind behind this plot made his plan very clear. The main captor of Kevin and Chris tells them both that they are going to conduct a robbery of their work, and they are going to do so flawlessly if they want to see their family or loved ones alive. The captor gives the men vague details of how the plan is going to go down, but primarily uses this time to enforce authority and respect, rather than spilling the beans too early. The captor then gives both of these men flip phones that only contain one number in the contact book. The contact, of course, being a burner phone owned by the captor. And for the rest of that night, Kevin and Chris sat helplessly in Kevin's apartment, waiting for the following day when they would be forced to not only betray their employer, but to embark on the largest bank heist in UK history. Following a long night of interrogation and intimidation, the sun finally rises, and the two men are instructed to get ready for work as normal. And as 11 a.m. rolls around, the two men are sent out of the house, being reminded of the stakes and told to act as if nothing was happening. Both Kevin and Chris arrive at work at 11:30 and 12, and as instructed, they go about their day as if nothing was happening. You see, Kevin and Chris weren't targeted randomly. One of the two were actually key holders, and they both had direct access to cash, as it directly correlated to their jobs, meaning that they were perfect targets for this heist. From 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., nothing out of the normal happened. Besides the fact that both Kevin and Chris had to use the phones they were provided to call their captors 3 times throughout the day, and to ensure that the captors had an opportunity to once again remind them both of the stakes. At exactly 5 p.m., the time when the bank closes, Kevin and Chris both make up an excuse of why they need to stay after hours. An excuse they come to is that they need to recount the cash, as today was so busy and they didn't have the proper time to accurately count everything in the vault. This was a valid excuse that didn't raise any eyebrows. And as every other employee of the bank left, Chris and Kevin were the only two people in the bank besides 2 security guards. As instructed, Kevin and Chris both make their way down to the vault and use their credentials to enter it without triggering any alarms. The bank vault in the Northern Bank actually requires 2 separate employees to have access cards to open the vault, and the 2 employees that hold these access cards are swapped weekly, meaning that whoever put this heist together knew exactly who to target at the exact right time. But we'll discuss that more later. As the 2 men entered the vault, they began the next phase of the operation. They began to fill a duffel bag full of big bills, 50 and 100-pound sterling notes, and in a roughly 15-minute time period, they were able to put over £1 million into one duffel bag. As instructed, once the money is in the bag, Chris calls the captors once again to be informed on where he needs to go, and the captor tells him that he needs to take this duffel bag to a bus stop directly outside of the bank. Chris follows those instructions, and as he arrives at the meetup location, a car arrives, takes the duffel bag, and to Chris and Kevin, their nightmare is finally over. The job is done, they gave them what they wanted, and nobody knows. That was until Chris started walking back towards the bank and received another phone call. Obviously, it was the captors, and they told him that the mission wasn't quite done yet. The first $1 million they got out of the bank was the first of many, and was more of a loyalty test than a heist. And now the true mission begins. Chris was informed that him and Kevin had to go back into the vault and basically fill every metal box they could find with cash and bring those metal boxes to the back door where delivery trucks will arrive and take them away. Now, obviously, this is much easier said than done, and the way that they're able to do this successfully is quite unique. After Kevin and Chris arrive back into the vault, they fill as many metal boxes as they can with cash. These metal boxes individually can fit anywhere from £500,000 to £1 million, and they get to work filling 12 different metal boxes on 2 separate carts. But the work isn't done yet, because now they need to take these 2 carts to the loading bay, which is the only place that cash can go in and out of the bank in bulk, which requires passing security guards and also going to a road that is only accessible to licensed vehicles. How Chris and Kevin end up doing this successfully is they put the money in boxes that are usually intended for waste paper, not actual cash. And Kevin and Chris are both able to use their seniority at the bank in relationship with the security guards to convince them to allow an unauthorized vehicle for a delivery, claiming there was too much waste paper due to the holiday and they needed a third-party service to take the waste paper away, and that it was okay. And while the security guards agreed to allow an unauthorized vehicle into the loading bay, they insisted they stand watch just in case. And just like that, Chris, Kevin, and a security guard stand at the loading bay, and a random unmarked truck arrives. 2 men step out of the truck, and all 5 of them load all of the waste paper into this van. And while at this point it would seem like, of course, the nightmare is now finally over, it wasn't quite yet. Because one of the men driving this truck handed Kevin a roll of garbage bags, and then left in the truck. Kevin and Chris knew what these garbage bags were meant for, and they quickly returned back to the vault and put all of the money that was left over that wasn't in the initial duffel bag or in the metal tins into these garbage bags. And surprisingly, Kevin and Chris were able to fit over £5 million into garbage bags. However, the hard part was moving these garbage bags past security. They already got rid of the waste paper, so what could this possibly be? And while the mission seemed impossible, Kevin and Chris had no other option. As the 2 men walked past the security guard wheeling multiple carts full of overfilled garbage bags, shockingly, the security guards did not bat an eye. Likely because it was assumed these men were doing simple cleanup after hours. And it does make sense considering these men had allegedly just gotten rid of a ton of waste paper, so potentially there was other waste paper or waste products that needed to be taken care of. Kevin and Chris once again make it to the loading bay, and they're once again accompanied by a security guard. And they all waited together for 45 minutes for the van to come back and pick up all of the garbage bags. During those 45 minutes, if the security guard even questioned what was in the bags at any point, the entire operation could have been blown up. However, that simply never happened. And after these garbage bags were loaded into the truck, the unassuming-looking robbers informed Kevin and Chris that their job was finally done, and that they could finally go home. However, at this point, even though the heist was complete, the hell for these men was not. After safely making his way home, Kevin Mullen immediately called authorities and reported that he was used in a crime to rob over £30 million from the bank that he worked at, and almost instantly an investigation was underway. However, he would likely come to regret this call, as during the investigation of the biggest heist in UK history, police actually ended up putting Kevin in jail for over a year while he awaited trial because they assumed he had to be involved because of how perfect this heist was. However, after that year investigation, they had to admit that they had nothing, and Kevin was set free, after now becoming a hostage of both criminals and the law. Following them letting Kevin go, they quickly turned their sights to Chris. Although, after a multi-year investigation into Chris, they also found that he was too innocent and not an insider. And while this entire situation took place over 22 years ago now in 2004, as of today, nobody has been arrested for the actual heist or robbery of the Northern Bank. And the roughly £30 million that was stolen was never recovered. Now, in the year following the robbery, there was 22 investigations that took place and 13 arrests. However, every single one of these arrests that took place only resulted in money laundering charges at best, and there was never a connection made to the people who actually perpetrated the heist itself. Only accessories, if you will. Possibly making the Northern Bank heist one of the, if not the biggest successful independent bank heist in human history. But we're still not done. Really quickly, I just wanted to say, believe it or not, this is the first video I've ever made about heists, and there is so many to talk about. If you guys want it, there is a heist-based video I want to make that revolves around weird heists. Like, for example, there's somebody who stole an entire transport truck full of Nutella, and that was never found. But I didn't know if that's too weird, if you guys would want to see it. But regardless, if you guys want more heist videos, leave a like or leave a comment below. Oh, and by the way, according to YouTube, only roughly 30% of you guys watching this video right now are actually subscribed. So if you like my videos and want to see a brand new one every single Friday, hit that subscribe button and become a bro today. Now, with all of the shameless self-promo out of the way, let's get to the next and final heist on this list.
The Kim Kardashian heist. It was Paris Fashion Week in 2016, and everybody who was anybody was in Paris. Kim Kardashian had just touched down, and she was making her way to her hotel. Where she was staying was known as one of the, if not the most luxurious hotels in all of France. It was known as the Hotel des Portelles, and the room that Kim had booked cost over $16,000 per night. Though not for no reason. Not only was this hotel luxurious, but it was known for its security and anonymity for celebrities. Access to this building was hidden behind gates, it had no marked address, and there was no formal lobby. Only a simple courtyard with a concierge. At face value, this seems like one of the best places to be. However, for Kim Kardashian, this hotel ended up being the place she would have one of the most terrifying experiences of her entire life. After making it to the hotel and arriving to her room, Kim was quick to post to social media, making it known that she was at Paris Fashion Week and that she was at one of the best hotels money could buy. However, this simple social media update wasn't as harmless as it seemed, as criminals in Paris were already plotting on robbing one of the celebrities to roll through their town. All they needed to do was pick one. And due to Kim Kardashian's massive online presence and habit at the time of posting live updates, she became the prime target for some of the most notorious jewelry thieves in all of France. Late into the night on October 2nd, 2016, after following almost every one of her updates online for days, 5 men decided to make a move. After gathering supplies and strategically planning, they disguised themselves as police officers and made their way to the exclusive hotel. Not only were these men disguised, but they were also armed. And using these disguises and weapons, they were able to quickly not only make their way into the courtyard, but into the hotel, threatening staff members at gunpoint and forcing them to lead them directly to Kim Kardashian's room. At this point, the men began to split up. One of the robbers stood on the street entrance of the hotel to ensure that nobody was entering. Following that, 2 of the men stayed in the courtyard to ensure that nobody from inside the hotel was trying to leave. And then the last 2 men took the concierge at gunpoint directly to Kim Kardashian's room. After the concierge brought the 2 men to Kim Kardashian's room, they forced the concierge to open the door, and both men entered the room, weapons drawn, pointing directly at Kim Kardashian. They yelled at her in French, told her to get onto the floor, and they bound her hands with zip ties, taped her feet together and taped her mouth closed, and then also bound the concierge and hid them both in a bathroom. One of the robbers stood in the bathroom, keeping them both at gunpoint, while the other man quickly dug through all of Kim's luggage and began collecting her jewelry. While Kim was in the bathroom, held at gunpoint, she let out a scream that woke up one of her friends that was also in the same suite. The suite was a multi-floor suite, meaning that her friend was essentially a floor below her. But when she was awoken to a scream, she knew something was wrong. So she locked herself in a separate bathroom and called Kim's bodyguard, who at the time was at the club with Kim's sisters. But unfortunately, this call was useless, because by the time that the bodyguard would arrive at the hotel, every single one of the robbers would be gone. And almost hilariously, they escaped on bike. That's right, the men who had just broken into a hotel and robbed Kim Kardashian at gunpoint, stealing a total of over $10 million worth of jewelry, left the scene of the crime on bikes. But that's not even the craziest part of the story. I'm gonna reveal that in just a sec. After the bodyguard arrived in the hotel, he cleared all of the rooms, found Kim, and unbound her and the concierge. And then they quickly notified the authorities. When the police arrived, unfortunately, they weren't able to do much, as at a first glance, there was absolutely no evidence. No fingerprints, no bullet casings, no tire marks. This heist was committed by professionals, although it wasn't the perfect crime. For weeks following the heist, Kim was left traumatized, $10 million poor, and police had almost no leads, making the situation look rather bleak. That was until investigators were able to find a small trace of DNA that were left on the plastic bindings used on Kim Kardashian's wrist. However, there was no exact match at that time, but that didn't mean they could get one. Over the next 3 months, police began building cases against every known criminal that could have possibly been involved. And then, all in one morning, police engaged in 17 raids at once of all potential suspects, storming their homes and gathering them for questioning. And interestingly, even though not all of those 17 individuals were involved, all 5 of the actual robbers were a part of those 17, meaning that the police did have their suspects, they just didn't know it yet. And from then on, it would take multiple years of a slow, grueling court proceeding for the truth to be revealed and justice to finally be served. Although the results may not be what you think. It wouldn't be until April of 2025 that the trials for the suspects would finally take place. Just for context, that's 9 years after the robbery took place. Regardless, 10 individuals were on trial. The 5 men who conducted the robbery and 5 additional accessories. Now, interestingly, it was on this trial that it became publicly known that almost everybody involved in this heist was elderly. For example, the 2 men that held Kim Kardashian at gunpoint during the robbery were both 60 years old at the time of the robbery, meaning that during the time of the trial, they were nearly 70 years old. And some of the other robbers involved were well into their 70s, which is why at the time the media was calling these robbers the Grandpa Gang or the Grandpa Robbers. And rightfully so. Regardless, the result of the trials came in May of 2025. And it was concluded that 8 of the 10 individuals on trial were found guilty. And out of those 8, one of the individuals who was considered the ringleader was given 8 years in prison. And the other 7 were given 3 to 8 years. However, none of them actually will serve prison time. And that's for 2 reasons. Firstly, because a lot of these suspects already served time in pre-trial detention. And secondly, because most of the robbers were in their 60s or 70s, with the oldest robber being 79, the court openly incited to not impose harsher sentences to ensure they stayed out of jail, simply because of their age. And whether or not that's right, I'll let you be the judge. But to me, it's kind of ridiculous how you can not only rob somebody at gunpoint, but do so and take over $10 million of personal valuables only to be caught in a 9-year-long legal proceeding, then just to be served basically a slap on the wrist because you're old. A tiny morbid bit of me thinks it's kind of hilarious to imagine 5 old people robbing Kim Kardashian at gunpoint only to escape on bikes with over $10 million worth of loot. But it's also important to recognize that while some of you may claim that $10 million is nothing to her, in reality, monetary value aside, those items had sentimental value. And besides that, this situation is traumatizing. Kim reportedly stated that she believed she was going to lose her life in this event, which isn't unreasonable at all. And regardless of fame or status, Kim is somebody's daughter, somebody's mom, somebody's ex-wife, and somebody's favorite movie star. And that's why I always like to emphasize whenever I discuss crimes that there are real victims in these situations. And we should try to be empathetic and sympathetic to our fellow humans.